Very good afternoon from Downing Street for this BBC News special. On the day Britain gets a new Prime Minister. It is a big day indeed, and within a few hours, Tony Blair will be gone. Gordon Brown, Britain's longest-serving Chancellor, will take over. They'll both be seeing Her Majesty the Queen over the next couple of hours to see Mr. Blair offering his resignation, Mr. Brown accepting the offer to form a government. Over in the House of Commons, a standing ovation for the Prime Minister at his final session of Prime Minister's Questions, where he paid a great tribute to the House and to what it achieves and means. Great scenes, we'll have a look at those in a few minutes' time. Today, by the way, a very quick handover of power, because our system of government doesn't really allow for great gaps when there's no one in charge. We're live on BBC One, we're live on BBC News 24 to bring you every stage of this handover, so stay with us as it all unfolds. This morning, let me tell you, the removal men have been busy. They've been taking the last of the Blair's possessions out of number 10. This process, by the way, has been going on for a long time, several weeks, but the last few possessions being loaded up in the vans this morning, including some exercise machines and other bits and bobs besides. And of course, they'll be off to the Blair's new home within a matter of a few hours. And there's the man in waiting, the Prime Minister in waiting, Gordon Brown, waiting patiently in his car this morning just outside the Treasury, making his way over to Downing Street later on, of course, after he's seen the Queen and accepted the invitation to form a government. At 11:15, the Prime Minister, with his Parliamentary Private Secretary, left number 10 for the last time for his last session of Prime Minister's Questions. All smiles, looking pretty relaxed, and once he got there, as we'll discover in a few minutes, he gave quite an astounding and skillful performance. So, Tony Blair's last departure within the past hour and a half or so from here, and we expect him back in Downing Street before long, because there's a session, a little party going on in there just to say a final farewell to the Prime Minister and his family. And who knows, we may see the Blair family on the doorstep together once again, in a reminder of that famous image that we had when they came in here. I was stood here in the street watching that happen 10 years ago. Now, just a few minutes ago in the House of Commons, a memorable session of Prime Minister's Questions when Mr. Blair faced David Cameron, the Conservative leader, over the dispatch box for the last time. Let's have a look at it.
I'm sure that life in the public eye has sometimes been tough on his family. So can I say on behalf of my party that we wish him and his family well, and we wish him every success in whatever he does in the future.
Let me thank him for those very generous sentiments. And may I say that for all the political disagreements between us, I think it is always important to be able to work with people on issues of national importance across the political divide, and I've always found him most proper, correct and courteous in his dealings with me, and I thank him for that. And although, of course, I cannot wish him well politically, nonetheless, personally, I wish both him and his family very well indeed.
Mr. Blair, in his words at the House of Commons, there were many tributes, by the way, including tributes from lots of opponents, even opponents on his own backbenches, generously saying that he is easily Labour's most successful leader in terms of winning elections. But during that session, all the big issues of the Blair premiership were rehearsed. Iraq and Afghanistan, after the recent losses of life again in both countries, the health service and education, and more besides. Now, over at the House of Commons, we're expecting Mr. Blair to depart in a few moments' time. Everything is ready, and the outriders ready to accompany the Prime Minister back to Downing Street. Inside the House of Commons, within the Houses of Parliament themselves, the Palace of Westminster, is the BBC's political editor, Nick Robinson, who's, of course, keeping a very sharp eye, as ever, on all these events. It's a very big day, Nick. What did you make of Mr. Blair's performance at his final session of Question Time?
Quite extraordinary scenes, Huw, but not in the way that I expected. The House of Commons, remember, hears, it doesn't clap. If it claps, it doesn't stand for an ovation. It did both those things for Tony Blair. On all sides, MPs of all colours got to their feet spontaneously and applauded him as he walked out of the chamber. And he ended a question time quite unlike the one I think he was prepared for. quite unlike the one that his backbenchers desperately wanted to see. They wanted a Thatcher-style bashing of the opposition as they had a go, and David Cameron, in an extremely clever parliamentary performance, sucked all the political heat out of the occasion by asking about the floods, by asking about the Middle East, and then praising Mr. Blair for his achievements and congratulating his family and wishing them well. All the Prime Minister could do was thank him in return, and Labour MPs started to mutter, waiting for a Tory question that would give them the opportunity to see their man take one more swipe at the opposition. He had a little gag when Nick Winterton, Sir Nicholas, raised a question from the Tory benches about an EU referendum, but this was more a sentimental farewell than a long-waited-for political bashing.
Prime Minister, back in Downing Street. Tony Blair with his Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, and inside a little reception which has been arranged for those final farewells with the closest members of staff. We saw some of them leaving for question time just before it started, including members of the press office, and David Hill, his Director of Communications. They're all in there ready for that final little drink session as they say goodbye. And Mr. Blair, after that, we understand, will probably be making his way to the palace, obviously, to see the Queen, and after that to go up to his constituency in County Durham in Sedgefield, where we expect him to announce that he will stand down as a Member of Parliament with immediate effect. His parliamentary career and his Prime Minister career are over at the same time. That's what we're expecting. Now, once Mr. Blair leaves Downing Street here in a short while, we expect him to travel over to Buckingham Palace, where he'll have an audience with the Queen. It's just a short distance away, of course, and he will tender his resignation after he arrives in the courtyard there, and the Queen will, in all likelihood, accept that. And after that, it'll be the signal to summon Gordon Brown. So there'll be a few minutes, if you like, when Britain officially has no Prime Minister, but our Constitution doesn't really allow for great gaps, so there'll be a very swift handover. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is at Buckingham Palace, and he'll be our guide to the protocol and the constitutional process there. Nick, what are we expecting?
The remarkable thing, of course, Huw, is that all the complexities of this transfer of power from one Prime Minister to another depend upon just a few words being spoken here at Buckingham Palace. As you say, Tony Blair is expected to arrive here. Well, he's expected at about 1:10. He's perhaps a few minutes late now, but at around 1:10 or 1:15, he will arrive here in the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. He will be going in through the King's door there, the door through which he has gone many, many times for his usually weekly audiences with the Queen. He will go up to the Queen's audience room and he will say that he is resigning as Prime Minister. The Queen will accept that resignation. Mrs. Blair will then join them for a short conversation. There are no seals of office to give back. The Prime Minister does not have any seals of office, so it will be a very short process. Tony Blair, with his wife, will then leave again through that door as ex-Prime Minister. He will leave in a different vehicle because he no longer has access, of course, to the Prime Ministerial convoy. And as you say, then just a few minutes later, Gordon Brown will be summoned from the Treasury. He will arrive here again with his wife, who will await in the equerries room while Gordon Brown goes up to the audience room. And again, there's no formality or particular procedure other than that the Queen will invite him to form a government. Now, by convention, the Queen always invites the person who has the confidence of the House of Commons to form a government. He is the leader of the largest party, so it is Gordon Brown who will receive that invitation. There is no kneeling, there is no kissing. Some dramas have depicted Prime Ministers kissing hands with the Queen. That does not happen. He simply accepts that invitation to form a government, and then after again Mrs. Brown will join them, brief conversation, and Gordon Brown then will leave. The first sight that we will have of him as the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be as he emerges there from the King's door, gets into the vehicles, and off he goes down the Mall, back to Downing Street as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the 11th Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth's reign.
Nick, we'll be back later on, but thank you very much, and especially for clarifying one thing. Lots of you have been emailing us about this phrase, kissing of hands. Of course, as Nick was making very clear there, it is, if you like, a kind of code. It's a kind of constitutional concept. It doesn't actually happen literally. It used to many years ago, but it doesn't these days. It simply signifies that the offer of the Prime Minister's position has been given and that it's been transferred and accepted. It's a formal confirmation, if you like, that the Prime Minister is in place. Now, today's scene here in Downing Street, if I can just show you what's around me, does remind me of being here back in 1997 because it is packed, absolutely packed, with hundreds of members of the press and media from all around the world, surrounded by colleagues from Spain and other parts of Europe, and of course from colleagues in British broadcasting and press media as well. It's a remarkable scene. There aren't many days where Downing Street buzzes quite in the way it does today. It certainly did in May 97, and it certainly does here today. It's that same kind of feel, though I have to say to you, we are absolutely keeping our fingers crossed for the weather. It looks rather ominously grey overhead, but hopefully it'll keep nice and dry. Now then, we've been talking about Gordon Brown, and of course he is now patiently waiting. He went over to listen to Prime Minister's questions. We saw him there on the front bench alongside Mr. Blair, chatting to Margaret Beckett, the Foreign Secretary. Will she be Foreign Secretary in a day's time? Who knows? These are all the kinds of decisions that Mr. Blair has to take. Carol Walker, our political correspondent, is at the Treasury. Carol, what's the latest word there?
Well, Gordon Brown is back here, having sat and listened to Tony Blair taking Prime Minister's question time for the last time, of course. Next week, he'll be the one standing there at the dispatch box. And for the man who has waited so many years for this moment, the moment when he finally takes over the reins of power, he's got another, perhaps up to an hour or so, to sit and drum his fingers while he waits to be summoned to the palace. But I'm told that he has got a great deal to be getting on with during that time. There are some important Treasury documents that he needs to sign off, parliamentary questions and so on. He's also, I'm told, been receiving some briefing ahead of the conversations he's going to be having later on with some of the world leaders. So a lot to go through and a lot to absorb there. But of course, he's also going to be saying farewell to some of the staff here at the Treasury. He's worked with many of them for 10 years. Many of those staff, of course, will remain here at the Treasury under the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. So there will be some farewells to go through, some thank yous to go through while he waits for that phone call. And I'm told that Robin Janvrin from Buckingham Palace will make the phone call to Gordon Brown's principal private secretary, James Bowler. He will take that crucial phone call from Buckingham Palace, and it's at that point that Gordon Brown will then set off from here, from the Treasury, to go to Buckingham Palace to wait for the Queen to formally invite him to form the next government.
OK, Carol, thank you very much. Carol at the Treasury, and of course we'll be back with Carol a little later on when we get some more movement there. It shouldn't take too long, by the way. That session of Prime Minister's questions, I think, will be seen as a pretty special one. The last one for Margaret Thatcher, when she was in power, was seen as very, very symbolic of the kind of power that she had, the fact that she relaxed into a great performance. This one with Mr. Blair, I think, will be seen in the same way because he fielded questions very skillfully, he was relaxed, he scored a few important points. Let's have another glimpse at one of the sections of that session.
Mr. Speaker, if I may just finish by saying two very brief remarks. Firstly, to this House, that I've never pretended to be a great House of Commons man, but I can pay the House the greatest compliment I can by saying that from the first to last, I never stopped fearing it. And that tingling apprehension that I felt at 3 minutes to 12 today, I felt as much 10 years ago and every bit as acute. And it is in that fear that the respect is contained. And the second thing I would like to say is about politics, and to all my colleagues from different political parties. Some may belittle politics, but we know, who are engaged in it, that it is where people stand tall. And although I know it has its many harsh contentions, it is still the arena that sets the heart beating a little faster. And if it is on occasions the place of low skullduggery, it is more often the place for the pursuit of noble causes. And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is the end.
Remarkable scenes in the House of Commons just a few minutes ago. Tony Blair's final session of Prime Minister's Questions, a standing ovation for him, a very generous tribute from his main opponent, the Conservative leader David Cameron, who wished him and his family well. And indeed, we expect to see the Blair family leaving number 10 in the next hour or so. And that, of course, will be a big moment for them too. A sense of the importance of the day, because not only is the atmosphere building here, but if you just have a quick peep at the end of Downing Street, you'll see that there are very big crowds gathered now at the gate itself. A huge crowd gathered right at the bottom of Downing Street, ready to see Mr. Blair leaving, and of course ready to see Mr. Brown arriving. Quite a crowd being kept out, of course, by those famous gates. Now, Blair versus Cameron is interesting. I've always been told by Mr. Blair's friends that the man he found trickiest to deal with over the dispatch box in his time, in his 10 years as leader, was William Hague, who was the leader up until 2001. And Mr. Hague joins us now from the central lobby of the Palace of Westminster. Mr. Hague, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
What did you make of that remarkable session?
Well, he's always been a great actor, Tony Blair, and I've always joked about the fact that I think he can summon up tears or whatever he wants to summon it whenever he wants to. But actually, looking across at him from a few feet away just now, that there was a tear in his eye that was not part of the act, really. I think he was genuinely very sad to come to the end of that. We, from our point of view, of course, are pretty pleased to see him go, because he's the most dangerous opponent that we've had in a couple of 100 years. But he's always been very skilled at Prime Minister's Questions. Of course, one has to acknowledge that, and I found it like trying to nail jelly to a wall a lot of the time. He was able to get out of some pretty tight fixes, and that will be a hard act to follow, I think.
It was a strange mix, wasn't it? Because there were some very trenchant criticisms again, people referring to areas that he allegedly hadn't delivered in, and that coupled with some very generous tributes, an odd mix.
Well, I think you're bound to get that on an occasion like this. You know, we want to give credit where credit is due on a day like this, and there is credit due on something like what has happened in Northern Ireland, and David Cameron specifically referred to that. And we wish Tony Blair well if he is going to take on this role in the Middle East as an envoy dealing with the Palestinian situation. Of course, we wish him well with that. We want him and the whole world to be able to succeed with that. So you do get that. But of course, you can't forget that at the end of this 10 years, people have lost their pension funds, the NHS is often in an atmosphere of crisis, many things that I think he himself hoped he would achieve, particularly with 3 large parliamentary majorities and a good economic situation that was left to him, have not been achieved. And so you're bound to get the criticism as well.
As we look ahead, Mr. Hague, what will be the dynamics of Cameron versus Brown at question time?
Well, I see it as the past versus the future, really. I don't think Gordon Brown can be the change that the country needs. He's been there over the last 10 years. He has been part of the spin, the author of the stealth taxes and so on. And I see David Cameron very much as the future. And so I think that is going to be really a different dynamic from what we have faced over the last 10 years, because I think Tony Blair was always able to pose for many years as the future against the Conservative Party that had just left office. But now we see a rejuvenated Conservative Party with a very effective leader and a Labour Party that now does carry the baggage of 10 years in office and many of the disappointments that I've just referred to. So we are into a new situation, and I think an exciting one for the country and for the Conservative Party.
William Hague, as ever, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huw.
William Hague, the former Conservative leader. Now, if you just joined us here on BBC One and on BBC News 24, we are live this lunchtime to cover the handover of power between Tony Blair, who's just had his last session of Prime Minister's Questions, and Gordon Brown, Britain's longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is, at this moment, we think over in the Treasury, awaiting that call from the Palace to go and be invited by the Queen to form the next administration. That is the sequence of events here. And of course, the crowd's gathering at all the main points, as you can imagine. at the Palace at Westminster here in Downing Street. Everyone wanting a good vantage point on what's happening today, but this is the best one. If you're here with us on News 24 and BBC One, we have the best vantage point of all. Now we're going to join John Sopel, who's with the Home Secretary, Dr. John Reid.
Huw, thanks very much indeed. John Reid, am I still calling you Home Secretary?
Yeah, for the next 20 minutes.
Next 20 minutes, and then you stop. Then you're just backbencher Dr. John Reid.
Well, I said I would stand down when Tony stood down as Prime Minister. So for the next half hour or so, I've got all this power and attention, and then after that, I'm a nobody, John.
What did you make of today in the Commons?
Well, I think it was fitting. I've never either experienced or seen anybody in the House of Commons getting a standing ovation. So I think that's a remark. It's an indication of the regard in which Tony is held as a leader, even by his opponents. And I think that's been one of his great qualities. You may or may not like him, but by God, he knew how to lead people.
You were one of those people who, before all this happened, you were urging him to stay on as Prime Minister. Yeah. Is he going too soon?
Well, my view's on the record, and that is that he shouldn't have announced he was going. I thought that debilitated him for a period, and that he ought to have stayed, but he didn't. He made his decision. That's fine. I've made mine. You don't regret it then. You get on with it, and our task now is to make sure that Gordon and the Labour government can face the next generation of big challenges, because 10 years ago we had unemployment, we had the economy in a bad state, inflation and so on. Nowadays we've got the environment, we've got terrorism, we've got a whole host of new problems, and they'll need a bit of support from the backbenches.
And how do you think that a Brown administration is going to be different from the Blair administration?
Well, one of the great challenges for politicians is that what the public always require is change with continuity. So they want things that are new, but they want the certainty of the old comforts. And I think Gordon's record gives us that idea of continuity, but he's going to have a new style. We've already seen it. We've already got defections from the Conservative Party. He's a substantial, he's got gravitas, he's got leadership, he's a big, big player. And I think people feel that in terms of security and leadership, he's the man to do it.
And a lot of people are surprised that you, having fought to break up the Home Office so that there was a Justice Department, wouldn't stay on to see it through.
Well, the blueprint is already in place. The three big issues which the Home Office are now facing are the three priorities of people of this country. Manage immigration fairly and effectively, and that is now all been reformed and it's underway. Counter terrorism, and we've now refocused the Home Office to direct our attention towards that and reduce crime. All of that is there, all of the reform programme being put in place. All of it started underway, and it's now up to my successor, whoever Gordon appoints, to carry it through. But I hope in a fairly short period, 14 months, there's been a lot done, though there's a bit left to do.
And you said you've got 15 minutes left, I think, as Home Secretary. What are you doing this afternoon and tomorrow?
About half an hour. Well, actually, one of the big things that we were doing yesterday was trying to tackle knife crime. And the last official meeting I had last night was an indication of some of the anguish personally that you have to try and address by people. It was a lady called Winnie Johnson whose son was killed 43 years ago by Brady and Myra Hindley, and we still haven't found the body. And that shows you that some of these challenges which make a difference to people's life, we do pay attention to, and ones like that we ought to. And I'm privileged to have been given that opportunity over the past few years.
Okay, John Reid, thanks very much for joining us. Enjoy your last 15 minutes as Home Secretary. Tony Blair probably just got 15 minutes left as Prime Minister. Huw, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. And John Reid there, of course, talking about some of the things that he's not been able to achieve, but also listing some of the things that he has. Here in Downing Street, we are awaiting the departure of the Blair family. And while we do that, I'm going to talk to the former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, who's been waiting patiently to talk to us. Mr. Blunkett, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What did you make of that Prime Minister's questions?
Well, I thought it had all the right mixtures of the difficult issues like Iraq, the amusing issues and the tremendous sense of humour that Tony Blair's often displayed at Prime Minister's questions, and a bit of pathos as well. I thought the standing ovation at the end was one of those wonderful moments that the House of Commons can rise to.
And in terms of the standing ovation at the end, even on the opposition side, it seemed pretty genuine.
I think it was. I think people have affection for Tony Blair, even when they've fallen out with him, and I think they'll recognise in years to come that 10 years of a tremendous statesman, someone we owe a deep debt of gratitude to, for the modernisation, the foundation on which Gordon Brown will be building for the future.
We see the family leaving as well with Mr. Blair, Mr. Blunkett, and we shouldn't forget that the last decade has imposed tremendous strains on them.
Enormous strains, because obviously this has been the first family with children for a very long time, the first children ever to go to state schools, incidentally, under a premiership. And Sherry Blair in particular has received a terrible drubbing in the newspapers, almost hate from one or two of the editors and senior staff, and I think she'll probably go out with a degree of relief.
And just a final thought, Mr. Blunkett, on the challenge for Gordon Brown.
Well, the challenge is a big one, because Britain faces globalisation, the modernisation of Britain and its equipping to cope with rapid social, cultural and economic changes is a very big one. But here's a big man, here's a successful Chancellor, here's someone with a clear leadership style and a vision of where he wants to go, and I think we're going to see that over the months and years ahead.
Mr. Blunkett, good to talk to you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary there, and his thoughts, not just on the end of the Blair era, but of course on the challenge for Gordon Brown. So the scene is set in Downing Street. Any minute now we are expecting Mr. Blair and his wife Cherie, and maybe the children too, to appear on the doorstep here, in front of the famous door of number 10, and say farewell to Downing Street for the last time as they head off for a new life, and Mr. Blair probably heading off for a new role as Middle East envoy, representing the European Union, the United Nations, America and Russia, what we call the quartet, representing them in the Middle East and trying to get that Middle East peace process back on the rails, which is no mean feat. And lots of people, of course, questioning whether Mr. Blair is the right person to be able to do that, given the fact that Iraq has caused such a huge controversy. Anyway, that's a debate probably for another day. Here in Downing Street, we are just being told that Mr. Blair is saying goodbye to just a few people inside the door in that kind of lobby area, and I think that that's the traditional thing. People will line the corridor which leads from the front door down to the Cabinet Office, and they will say their final farewells, and I would bet a lot of money that lots of them are in tears. 10 years is a long time, and of course the relationship between the Prime Minister and the staff in Downing Street can become very, very close indeed. We saw it at the end of the Thatcher period, we saw it too at the end of the Major period, and it would be wonderful to see the pictures inside, but understandably that is a pretty private matter for now. They should be out in a few seconds. Why don't we join John Sopel again with John Prescott? If we get any movement in Downing Street, we'll be straight back, John.
OK, Huw, yeah, we'll be watching that black door very closely indeed, but let me bring in the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott. I'm still right to call you the Deputy Prime Minister?
Yes, for a little while longer, I think, and there's a little gap in between us. Who knows what can happen?
You may be in charge.
That'd shake a few people, wouldn't it?
So what do you feel today?
I'm very happy. Tinged with sadness, of course, but I think we've had 10 years, we've had a good run, we've been very privileged, we've delivered on what we promised, and I think the House of Commons showed on both sides he's been a great Prime Minister, and I'm privileged to serve with him.
You're not normally a man prone to sort of great shows of sentiment. What did you think, though, when there was that sudden standing ovation for him?
Oh, I thought that was tremendous. The House of Commons showing what they thought of this man, really. Whatever's said in the press, great respect for a great Prime Minister, and that's what he will go down as. And no sentiment, no, get on with the next job, but a wonderful ovation for him.
You've had your very public job as Deputy Prime Minister. You've also had a private job, which is at times to have almost been a mediator between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair when things have got difficult. Was that frequent?
On occasions we had dinners, but that was quite normal, really, to have a discussion about matters, and I'm pleased to have be involved with it. It was a great privilege, but I've been a friend to both of them, because at the end of the day we're working for the country as well as the Labour Party, and we've kept on track for 3 elections, so it seems to have worked.
On occasions we had dinners. I think that's probably a bit of an understatement of what went on there.
Well, I was a waiter for 10 years, so I could help in the situation. You know, you get the conviviality of a meal and a discussion and an agreement, and on course to deliver as we promised. And now, after 10 years, it's worked.
Right, now what do you think the difference will be between a Blair administration and a Brown administration?
Well, I think they'll still be governed by that phrase I always use, traditional values in a modern setting, and what we have shown that no other government has for an awful long time. Economic prosperity and social justice, that is to get people back to work, a stable economy and investment in our public services. Gordon Brown has been an essential part of that in the 10 years. I don't think that's going to be changed, and I think we'll see another successful period of a Labour government under Gordon Brown.
But do you think there will be differences? They're very different men.
Of course they are, but I mean, it's the principles and the values that Gordon talked about and Tony talked about, which I've tried to put together as the traditional values in a modern setting. That allows for the change. God blimey, even the Tories talking about conservative principles now and meeting the modern circumstances, so perhaps they've even pinched one of my policies.
Yes, but isn't that the challenge, in a sense, that you've got David Cameron, very telegenic, very attractive to the voters out there, a new sort of start for the Conservative...
Very attractive to the guy that's just resigned. I think the thing he said, you couldn't understand where he stood on anything, he didn't stand for any principles, so he has the image, but he doesn't have the substance. That'll be the charge against him. But who can doubt whether Gordon Brown's got the substance? Just look at the prosperity we've had in 10 years.
Now, what about Tony Blair as Middle East envoy for the Quartet Group? I mean, a lot of people would say, after Iraq, after his support for Israel in the Lebanon war last year, he's not the man to bring peace to the Middle East.
Well, I understand what you mean by that, but they said that about when he started on Northern Ireland, and Mr. Paisley made a tremendous tribute to him. A man who keeps on going, keeps his eye on the ball, and eventually is able to persuade people. And I think in Israel, I know, and Palestine, and the two-state solution, he's always felt strongly about that. He did hope more would come out of the Iraq situation and the agreement with Bush. Now he's going to have a good opportunity, and if he can do for that part of the world, Palestine, perhaps we can bring peace in that area. And if there's one man who's got the courage, the conviction and the patience, it's Tony Blair.
John Prescott, you've talked about how you see the 10 years in terms of the prosperity and meeting the promises that you kind of have. If I asked you to, you'd probably still find
you don't want to bring out your
pledge card. Yeah, I knew you'd have your pledge card.
I mean, if you'd invited me to do it, there it is.
Lots of money
delivered
as well,
on it. And I'll be going round in the next couple of years making that point time and time again.
Right, but you say you produce your pledge card, but on Iraq, isn't that what everyone is going to be remembering the Blair years for, above everything else?
Well, I think, of course, it's a very important issue. And I mean, the Prime Minister made clear how he felt about that today in his final speech almost to Parliament. And it will be remembered, but people will remember what he's done also. He did what he thought was right, and I think there's a general feeling, given the circumstances of when that decision was made, hopefully we can come to some kind of peaceful arrangement out of Iraq eventually. But at the end of the day, he was courageous, he made a decision, and no doubt that's very much in people's minds, but history won't judge him on Iraq. History will judge him what he's done in this country and what he's done to help in many other countries.
I wonder whether you and other cabinet ministers wish they'd held him to account a bit more, wish they'd pushed it a bit harder in cabinet when the decisions were being taken to support the invasion of Iraq.
Well, we had lots of discussions in cabinet, and indeed Parliament had many discussions about it. There was all this argument about whether we'd got the correct information, but at the point in time we supported that policy. We don't run away from it now. I have the privilege, of course, of sitting on the sofa and talking to him, and you can be sure I can express my concerns about that. But that was a united government position on that matter. We went into it hopefully to bring democracy into Iraq, and that's still our hope and our aim.
One other issue that I suspect you don't look back on with great fondness, that was how you raised the money to fight the last general election. You promised that you were going to be white and white, you were going to be transparent. You introduced legislation so that donations have to be declared, and then you start taking loans that don't have to be declared.
Well, I think that whole matter's still been under investigation. You wouldn't want me to comment on that either.
I'm not talking about the police investigation, I'm talking about the loans.
But that's what's generally in people's minds about that. But all parties have received donations, often from wealthy people. And I think to that extent it has been part of it. But I think there are a lot of changes coming on. Some we've already done, more to come, I'm sure, as Gordon Brown has said, to actually deal with that. But I've been a supporter of state financing. I prefer to have the state financing where you know where the money comes from, people understand it, and it's transparent that that's the case. And I'm still advocating state finance.
That's interesting. So no money from big business? no money from the
Well, I
unions?
think you can make conditions. We've gone down to how much money. If somebody gives £1,000 or £5,000, £100,000, the connections that have been made about honours have made it very difficult. But I do believe state financing is by far the better way of dealing with it. But not only just giving the money, making sure we limit the expenditures. Too much money goes on press advertising and advertising at the present stage. Let us get some reality into the expenditure and some reality, of course, into where the money comes from. And that's what the National Executive, the party's been doing and will continue to do.
You've talked about the money spent on advertising, and I was talking to one of the ministers who's tipped for promotion to the cabinet, who was saying we've been too fixated on the media as a government, and maybe that will change under Gordon Brown. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. I think
You have been too fixated on the media?
I think the media plays too much part. I think Murdoch plays too much part. I think all these media barons. Look at the two guys who came from Jersey or something, was it? The Jersey Islands, and actually bought the Telegraph. Look where they changed the Telegraph. They kick off the good journalists, bring all the pro-Tories on. We've always had to fight against
You weren't saying Murdoch's too powerful when you were still in office and had to go.
I've always said it. And don't say me you don't say it. I've never been happy about that relationship, whichever political party, and they're all in it. And the media have that influence.
OK, John Prescott, thanks very much.
As well.
OK, John Prescott, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Huw, that black door still hasn't opened.
No, John, that's absolutely right, but I'm told it will within the next few minutes or so. The final farewells are still being said, and it's understandable that these things don't exactly work exactly to time, because people may have some conversations, and these are very unusual meetings and moments, to say the least. The crowds have gathered, and very soon Mr. Blair will leave Downing Street with his family, make his way from here over to Buckingham Palace. They'll drive down the Mall, past the crowds there, and they'll make their way to the big courtyard and the King's staircase in Buckingham Palace, and then they'll be off, we think, to Sedgefield, Mr. Blair's constituency. And after that, we expect Mr. Brown to be summoned to the palace, and for him to come back here to Downing Street to announce that he has been asked to form the next government and that he's accepted that task. Prime Minister and Mrs. Blair leave Downing Street for the last time. The children are left at number 10. They won't be making the journey to the palace to see the Queen. Mrs. Blair will accompany her husband Tony to see the Queen for that last audience as he tenders his resignation. And now the constitutional process is well underway. We are now witnessing the handover of power in that brisk British way of ours, because once the resignation has been tendered, there will be an immediate phone call to the Treasury to summon the next Prime Minister, who of course will be Gordon Brown. A rather interesting departure, moving. Mr. Blair and Mrs. Blair embracing their children as if to say thank you for the past 10 years. Leo, of course, little Leo was there, not here in '97, but very much here now. And Mrs. Blair, in a very direct message to the media, I was slightly disconcerted that she said it almost directly to me. "We won't miss you at all," she said, as she got into the car. James Landale, our political correspondent, is with me here. James, I think she meant that.
She did. She has, to be fair, been on the receiving end of quite a lot of negative media coverage over the years, famously over the Nannygate issue, and clearly she wanted to get her final word in, and she used it directly and to the point.
And Mr Blair obviously wanted his last words to be in the Commons itself and not here in Downing Street.
Yeah, that was deliberate strategy. He didn't want in any way to have whatever he said overshadowing anything that might be said or not by the Chancellor when he comes back as Prime Minister we expect, within the hour or so.
James, thanks. The Prime Minister is on his way down the Mall, past all the flags that have been there since the Queen's birthday parade and the Falklands parade a few days ago, on their way down to Buckingham Palace. And there'll be a little switch over there, we expect. We expect the Prime Ministerial car to stay in Buckingham Palace for Gordon Brown to pick up after he's seen the Queen. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is there. Nick, I'll hand over to you for the moment.
Well, the last Prime Ministerial convoy that Tony Blair will travel in, approaching the Victoria Monument there, people gathered watching these last moments of Tony Blair's at times tumultuous 10 years as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The vehicle now turning in through the gates of Buckingham Palace, a journey that Tony Blair has made on many, many occasions during these past 10 years to attend his audience, but on this occasion with his wife, coming in now through the archway and into the quadrangle here of Buckingham Palace. And in a moment the car will sweep around to the King's door, and we will begin the first stage of this process that, of course, we haven't witnessed for 10 years since one Prime Minister came to Buckingham Palace to resign. That was John Major then, and another man, Tony Blair, as was a victorious Prime Minister in that general election, came to be asked to form a government, being greeted there by the Queen's senior lady-in-waiting and an equerry, and they will now go in through the King's door. Mr Blair will be greeted by the Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Robin Janbrin, who will take him up to the audience room while Mrs Blair waits in a room downstairs. And up in that audience room where the Queen has been waiting, he will explain to her that he is resigning as Prime Minister. As I said earlier, there are no seals of office for him to give back. The Prime Minister does not have any such seals of office. It's expected to be quite a short audience of the Queen, and then Mrs Blair will be invited to join them, and they will, I'm sure, spend a few moments just talking about their plans now, possibly this Middle East job, perhaps the trip to Sedgefield and his retirement as MP. And already out here in the quadrangle we can see that the police are preparing, just moving the cars, or preparing to move the cars, because we would expect him not to leave in the Prime Ministerial Daimler, but to leave in another vehicle. Tony Blair will, of course, still have security for many years to come, and he will require that security, but already the reins of power are starting to shift. So by now one must imagine that he will be up in the audience room with the Queen, and that process of this transfer of power will have begun. And perhaps it's a remarkable thing that in a country such as ours, which goes in for so much ceremony and panoply of such things, the actual transfer of power from one Prime Minister to another depends, as I said earlier, just on a few words being spoken by the Queen. First, she accepts the resignation of the one Prime Minister, and then in perhaps 10 or 15 minutes we will see the new man, Gordon Brown, arriving here at Buckingham Palace to be invited to form a government.
Nick, thank you very much. We'll be back with you, of course, as soon as the Blairs emerge. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, explaining that this audience is not expected to take that long, but of course the audience with the new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, should take longer. They'll have more to talk about, and the Queen may well express an interest, of course, in the kind of cabinet that we're likely to see. Watching the pictures with me, our political editor Nick Robinson, who's joined me now in Downing Street. Nick, just a quick word about the remarkable session of Prime Minister's questions we saw.
Yes, extraordinary. We expected him to try and swat away a fifth Tory leader. The Labour benches were desperate for him to do it. He had his prepared gags. But David Cameron socked the politics out, congratulated him, and the whole session was like that. So it ended with an emotional "that's it" from Tony Blair, a gulp and a standing ovation from all sides, all men and women of all politics. We've never seen anything like it. He going with that dignity, but a little sign that you were commenting on, Huw, that Cherie Blair still doesn't quite forgive. as she left Downing Street for the last time, mouthing to the camera, "We won't miss you at all." And I saw her going into the chamber to watch him. I wished them well, Huw and Blair. The children smiled. Mrs. Blair looked rather daggers at me.
How was that dynamic going to change with Gordon Brown? The relationship with the media, certainly.
Well, it's great at the moment, isn't it? There's a change. The media likes to have novelty. But what we know is that Gordon Brown can be a difficult man. And when things are not going well, I've no doubt that, like with every Prime Minister, he'll complain about the media, the political weather, if you like, as they all have.
Nick, many thanks. Stay with us. We'll be back with you in a short while. If you've just joined us on BBC One and on BBC News 24, we are hosting live coverage of the handover of power between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. The 1 o'clock news, by definition, has been delayed. It's now 20 past 1, but let's join Sophie for the rest of the day's news.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. There are fears that a fifth person may have died as a result of the severe flooding across England. Emergency services are using heat-seeking equipment to search for a man who's missing in a dike near Doncaster. This morning, 2 more rivers have burst their banks in Nottinghamshire, and people in the town of Retford have been told to evacuate their homes. In a moment, we'll be hearing from Robert Hall at Catcliffe in South Yorkshire and from Rajesh Merchandani at Upton-upon-Severn in Worcestershire. But our first report is from Danny Savage, who's at Tolbar near Doncaster, where the army has been brought in to help.
Well, Sophie, this is the main street in Tolbar, a village on the A19 just north of Doncaster. Local people tell me that 80% of the houses here have been affected by flooding. It started deteriorating the situation at about 3 o'clock this morning, and ever since then they've been trying to cope with the rising water. It may have stopped raining here more than 24 hours ago, but for the 1,200 or so people who live in Tolbar, the full horror and misery of the flooding has only become apparent in the last few hours.
There's nothing you can do. I mean, you don't want to cry, but my house is just a mess.
Well, it's just unreal. It's so surreal. You can't believe it, really, but just get on with it and make the most, help as many people out as you can.
A combination of groundwater rising and a beck bursting has meant hundreds of people have had to be rescued. This heavily pregnant woman was given priority by a fire service rescue boat. One of many people moved to a local leisure centre. Others have had to wade out or are still trapped in their homes. And the people here have been told the waters are still rising.
Danny, give us the latest on the search for this man who, it seems, has fallen into a dike somewhere.
Yeah, that's happening about just a mile or so from where I'm standing at the moment. They've got boats in the river at the moment with police divers trying to search this swollen river Ebeck. It appears that a local woman heard a man or a boy shouting in that river at about 11 o'clock this morning. And ever since then, we've seen helicopters in the sky nearby and emergency service sirens as they try and search for this missing person. But still no person found yet on that ongoing operation.
And elsewhere, the army has been brought in to deal with what potentially could be a pretty serious situation.
Yes, there's a size of an old power station here at Thorpe Marsh. Now, there at the moment, there's an electricity substation, and the army have been brought in to sandbag that substation, which has been threatened by the River Don bursting its banks, and because that station supplies a lot of the electricity to the whole area around Doncaster. So they've brought the army in to try and make sure that this substation stays dry, but it seems to be like an island at the moment, surrounded by water.
Danny Savage, thank you very much. Well, in South Yorkshire, hundreds of people have had to spend a second night in emergency refuge centres because of fears that a nearby dam could burst. Some of them live in Catcliffe near Rotherham, and our correspondent Robert Hall is there now. Robert, what's the situation there?
Well, Sophie, on the floodplain of the River Don, little perceptible change. The water levels here, unlike downstream at Doncaster, there's been some improvement. You can see how little, though, from the edge of the water there to this line of debris just in front of me. That's really all that we've seen while we've been here since the early hours of this morning. All around the region, the clean-up and damage assessment has begun, but the skies have been dark, rain has been falling, and it promises to be a third miserable day. Hour after hour, street after street, this clean-up is painfully slow and often back-breaking work for the council teams who've struggled here through continuing traffic chaos.
It's been really hard, shocking. Wow, very hard. I've never seen it as bad.
This is Helmed Island, a centuries-old industrial area alongside the River Don. The water levels here have fallen, but whole trees are still embedded in bridges, and the lanes around the office blocks are covered in stinking mud. At the Kelham Island brewery, every drop of beer has been contaminated. It will take weeks to restart production.
We've had, pubs say we don't care about the condition of the beer, just get it to us. We can't have the regulars without it, and obviously we can't do that.
Across South Yorkshire, so many questions. How can communities and individuals recover? How could this happen? The flood has stirred old debates over the wisdom of building on floodplains. After the past 48 hours, those voices can only get louder. Well, that debate, of course, continuing, but to people around here, there's just one priority. Those that aren't at home, to get home, and those that have managed to get back home, to try and get their homes into some sort of habitable condition. And to add to their misery, so many here just weren't insured for this. Sophie.
Robert, thank you very much. Well, let's go to Worcestershire now, where the threat of more flooding is by no means over. But in some towns, flood barriers have helped to limit the damage. Rajesh Merchandani is at Upton upon Severn. Rajesh.
Sophie, thank you. Yeah, here at Upton, they've had full flood defences in position since about Monday night. They sort of come as flat-pack kits. They're quite easy to put up, but they're not particularly cheap, so you've got to weigh up the costs and the benefits. The rationale is basically how much risk of flooding is there to local properties, and look how close these properties are. I mean, already the water here is coming up sort of near the top of my wellies. It's about a foot, but let's just take you a bit wider. Take a look over here. This is actually the River Severn, and look where it is. It's burst its banks, and it's coming up to this level. I'd say that is about a metre difference, and what's holding it back? It's the flood defences here. So the people of Upton are very pleased that these are in place. In Worcester, the Environment Agency decided they didn't need to put flood defences in there. I've been there today. Take a look what happened. It's a different kind of final furlong. Canoeists take pleasure at Worcester Racecourse under 4 feet of water. The floodplains of the River Severn are submerged, roads cut off, businesses not working, people frustrated. The city's flood defences were not deployed.
Last night at about 6:30 there was one lorry offloading a few sandbags here, and obviously that was an inadequate response.
I think it's messing up the race course. There's business lost there, there's business lost over there. A lot of wildlife gone, I should think.
Don't understand why they can't just build a 3-foot mound of earth along there, which would stop all this, I'm sure.
The Environment Agency says their priority is to protect people and property, not highways, and that the situation in Worcester is totally unprecedented. Here's why they think that. Just downstream where the Severn meets the River Team, the Team is so swollen it's causing the Severn to back up. Authorities say they didn't expect the waters to be so high, but tried telling that to flood campaigners. So do you think they made a mistake, the Environment Agency?
Yeah, I do think they've made a mistake. I think, they've got an awful lot on their plates, and they had to make a measured judgment, and I think on this time they've slightly cocked it up.
It's a difficult decision to make, as it costs many thousands each time flood defences are used. Even here in Upton, there is some flooding, despite the barriers. But what would it have been like without them? Well, the question everyone wants answered is what's going to happen next? In Worcester, the Environment Agency say they think what happened there was a fully localised event which should have no knock-on effect downstream, which means here. They think the river is levelling off, not rising anymore, but steadying. They are pumping out cellars here, but one shop owner told me she'd noticed that the level was actually going down. But it is raining, more is forecast, and as ever with this story, we'll only believe it when we see it. Sophie.
Rajesh, thank you very much. And thank you again to everyone who's sent in photos and videos of the flooding over the past 2 days. We've had more than 4,000 pictures, and please do keep sending them in. The latest show the huge disruption caused by Monday's torrential rain across the Midlands and Yorkshire. These pictures are of a salvage yard in Aldwickler Street in Doncaster. People crossing the street here in Hillsborough. Not even the deceased have been spared, as this graveyard near Tenbury shows. And finally, this fish is making the most of a garden turned pond in Stockbridge, Sheffield. Other news now, and 2 more people have been stabbed to death in London and Essex overnight. A teenager was killed after being involved in a disturbance on this street in Islington. And a man in his 20s was found by police and paramedics collapsed in a street in Ilford in Essex. It's the latest in a spate of such killings in England. Doctors have voted in favour of giving women quicker access to abortions in early pregnancy. At the British Medical Association's annual meeting, they voted in favour of removing the need for the signatures of 2 doctors for abortions before 13 weeks. But the government says it has no plans to make any changes to the 1967 Abortion Act. And some news just in the last few minutes. Labour and Plaid Cymru have said they want to form a power-sharing government for Wales. The coalition would have to be agreed by special conferences of both parties, but would give Plaid Cymru its first ever ministers in the Assembly. Let's have a look at the weather now with Thomas Schaffenacker. Thomas.
Sophie, thank you. It's not necessarily good news on the weather front at all. Another warning from the Met Office, early warning of heavy rain this weekend. But for the time being, it's cool and showery today. Very cool, in fact, across Scotland. Temperatures below the average. And some of the showers that do brew this afternoon will be falling as sleet, even snow across the mountains of Scotland. And in the northeast, quite heavy with some cracks of thunder too. But any showers today that do brew will be very scattered around. So there's going to be some dry weather too. Temperatures of around about 18 degrees Celsius in London. Feeling very cool, especially on the coast itself, in the breeze coming in from the north or the northwest. And as I say, the showers brewing through the afternoon pretty much anywhere across the country, but some of us escaping them and seeing some dry weather. We'll end the afternoon on a cool note across Northern Ireland, and tonight will be a very chilly night, a touch of ground frost across the Highlands of Scotland, even in London, temperatures down to single figures. Tomorrow morning we start off mostly sunny across central England, but rain gathers in the southwest and the west of Scotland. But it's Saturday, the day that we're worried about possibly 1 inch or 2 inches of rain on the way. Sophie.
Thomas, thank you very much. And that's it from me for now. Let's go back to Huw now in Downing Street. Huw.
Sophie, thank you very much. Yes, welcome once again to Downing Street. We are in that process of handover. Tony Blair has left Downing Street. He's gone to Buckingham Palace, where he is seeing the Queen, and his car there just stopped outside the main King's Steps within the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. And over at the Treasury building is the Chancellor. Not the Chancellor for much longer. Gordon Brown waiting to leave the Treasury for the last time as Chancellor and to accept an invitation from the Queen to form a government. An invitation, of course, that he will accept. He's got the parliamentary muscle to do that, and he is the new Labour leader. That is the process, and that's the way things are likely to happen. It's interesting, of course, to dwell today on the fact that Gordon Brown is Britain's longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he is replacing a Prime Minister who is one of the longest-serving, certainly on record, Tony Blair, having completed more than 10 years in office. We're going to talk to some of our experts now. I'm joined here in Downing Street by our political editor, Nick Robinson, and our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, is at Buckingham Palace. Also at Westminster is the constitutional expert, Professor David Cannadine. So we'll talk to our 3 guests as we wait for Mr. Blair to leave the palace and as we wait for that invitation to be extended to Gordon Brown at the Treasury. Nick, at this moment in time, I'm assuming the resignation has been accepted, so we're in that little gap, aren't we?
A gap with no Prime Minister. And if you think that's unusual and odd that no one is in control of the country, in times past it often lasted for a matter of days. When Lloyd George resigned, it was 4 days before Bonar Law took over. We were without a Prime Minister, and when Churchill did it, it was a day before Eden. Now, just a matter of minutes. I'm told that there is more than one finger on the nuclear trigger, so were such a thing, God help us, to be necessary, there is someone else in charge, although of course Gordon Brown could be rushed round to the palace mightily quickly to make him the new Prime Minister.
Now, once Mr. Blair leaves, all those trappings, all that support system that he's been used to for a decade will, most of it anyway, will fall away.
And much of it already has. You described the car there, we see it there. It's no longer his car. It was his car until he stepped into Buckingham Palace. It is now the Prime Minister's car, and he is no longer the Prime Minister. He will have to get into another car. Now, not so long ago, when Ted Heath gave his resignation, he came out from seeing Her Majesty to discover there was no car. Nobody had thought what he'd do. The car, nicknamed Pegasus for security reasons, had actually shot back to Downing Street to pick up Harold Wilson, and they had to phone up and say, has anybody got a car in the government pool in order to bring him back? Mr. Blair, because of security these days, of course, has protection and cars and police officers, but it still will be a different one, and he won't have access to the magical Downing Street switchboard, which allows him to be put through on the phone to anybody he likes round the world just by saying, get me Huw Edwards, get me the President of the United States. He'll have to dial for himself.
Looking at the Treasury, Nick, and all the staff they're lining up who've been used, of course, to this decade of power under Gordon Brown. A few thoughts, maybe? What is Gordon Brown thinking right now?
I think he'll be thinking, my God, I've actually got it. When we talk of the achievements, as you did, of being the longest-serving Chancellor, he is also the longest-serving ever next Prime Minister. They come and go, don't they? We say Ken Clarke's about to be the next Tory, or Dennis Healey years ago, or Rab Butler for the Tories. They never did, though, because actually it's very hard to stay the apprentice for that long. You're almost always removed. Gordon Brown's remarkable political achievement, at some cost to himself and his reputation, has been to fight, to hang on, to say, it will be my turn, I will do it. And I think he will ponder on that. And having spent some time with him in his constituency recently and in his father's church in Kirkcaldy, I don't think it is spin to suggest he will be thinking of his father. When I asked him about it, tears come into Gordon Brown's eyes when you mention his father. The sense of duty, of service, of having to live up to what his father believed in is very, very important to him.
Nick, thank you. Well, we're still waiting for Mr. Blair to leave Buckingham Palace, and we're waiting, of course, for Mr. Brown to appear at the Treasury. Let's stay with these pictures and talk to one of our other guests, Professor David Cannadine, who's in another part of Westminster. Professor Cannadine, thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Huw.
What are your thoughts on this process of handover?
Well, my thoughts, I suppose, are that it's a very orderly process of handover, as well as being a very rapid one. And in a curious sort of way, that's an interesting epitaph on the joint Blair-Brown years. We're often told that they've had a troubled and stormy partnership in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. But in fact, it's been the most successful collaboration ever between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor in terms of how the economy's done and in terms of how the Labour Party has done. And that's often not stressed, which I think it ought to be. And the orderly transfer of power from one to the other now, as Blair retires as Prime Minister and as Brown succeeds him, is in a sense all of a piece with that story, which, as I say, is often not the story we're told, but is, I think, in many ways the most important story of the joint Blair-Brown years.
What do you expect Mr. Brown to be up to in the first few hours in Downing Street?
Well, he will be forming his cabinet, which is what Prime Ministers always do in their first few hours in Downing Street. That's the point, rather like choosing a menu in a restaurant when all the options are open, but once you've chosen the meal you want, you can't have the other meals you might have liked. And by the same token, he'll have huge freedom of manoeuvre during the first few hours in office. But once senior posts are filled, then of course his options will get less. But the process of cabinet making is always one of the most exciting and enjoyable aspects of being Prime Minister, and of course, and by definition, of being a new Prime Minister.
I was rather cheekily making the assumption that Mr. Brown probably knows, and has known for some time, Professor Cannadine, maybe who's in that cabinet. Would you agree with that?
Well, we will have to talk to him about that. I'm sure he has got some ideas already worked out. Nevertheless, there's a difference between putting your cabinet on the back of an envelope and actually appointing the people for real. And so we are now into reality rather than hypotheticals. And I should have thought he will find reality rather exhilarating.
Professor Cannadine, thank you very much for joining us. Good to talk to you. Thank you. Over to the Treasury. Our correspondent Carol Walker is there. Carol, what are the signs?
Well, everyone is now just waiting for Gordon Brown to head off for the palace. He's had this hour or so since he returned from Prime Minister's questions, and another hour or so of waiting to be summoned to the palace. I'm told that during that time he occupied himself by signing off some Treasury papers and indeed looking through some briefings for some of the conversations he's going to be having later this evening with other world leaders. He, of course, by that time will be the British Prime Minister. We know that Tony Blair has had his audience with the Queen. He'll have been waiting now for the phone call from Robin Janvrin at Buckingham Palace to the Principal Private Secretary James Bowler here at the Treasury. That will be the moment when Gordon Brown will formally be summoned to Buckingham Palace to be invited by the Queen. Of course, there have also been quite a few farewells to go through here at the Treasury. As we've been hearing, he's had this extraordinary record, 10 years here. Many of the staff he's been working with have been here throughout that decade. So there have been some tributes, there have been some farewells, there has been a chance for him to thank the staff who've been alongside him for so long. But of course, Gordon Brown, being the man that he is, will be impatient to be getting on with it. You could see him there during Prime Minister's question, almost twitching with the anticipation. The last Prime Minister's questions, of course, when he'll have been sitting down on that front bench listening to Tony Blair. next week he will be the one standing there at the dispatch box answering those questions. Here at the Treasury, they've been waiting. We can see the staff lined up to wish him a farewell. He'll be leaving from here in his official Treasury car. It's here with the engine running outside, ready to whisk him off to the Buckingham Palace. He'll be leaving, of course, as Prime Minister.
Carol, thank you. Straight over to Buckingham Palace and our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
Well, 23 minutes he's been in there, Huw, so far, and you probably saw just the pictures a moment ago. An equerry came out with what appeared to be a box which went into the boot of the car. Now, the car hasn't actually been changed over. I think that they must have done it earlier. It is the same vehicle that he arrived in that he will be leaving in. That perhaps a measure of the need for the security that will surround Mr. Blair, but I don't know that it is a prime ministerial car. It doesn't seem to have quite so many bits and pieces on it now. As we will see him in a moment as an ex-Prime Minister, he doesn't quite need all the communications equipment, but I think that there we are. We see Mr. and Mrs. Blair now emerging from the King's door of Buckingham Palace, having Mr. Blair having submitted his resignation to the Queen and it having been accepted, and they wave as they make their way now into their future lives after 10 years in number 10 Downing Street. And an equerry and a few others just waving them off as the vehicle picks up speed and makes its way out of the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. And Mr. Anthony Blair gives a wave to us, the media here, crouched in a corner, as the car goes through that central, or that side archway, I should say, and makes its way across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace and out through the main gates. And what lies in store now for this man? Well, who can say? What we do know, of course, is that only a matter of minutes will now pass before we see the next man, Gordon Brown, making his way here to Buckingham Palace, to his audience with the Queen and to that invitation from the Queen to form a government.
Nick, thank you very much. As you say, that telephone call probably being made right now from the Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Robin Janvrin, to the private office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer over at the Treasury. Mr. Blair, his final audience with the Queen complete. He must have had, well, let's do the sums, around 500 of them during his decade in office, but that's his last as Prime Minister. And now the process moves into another kind of gear, because the phone call is probably being made. Mr. Brown will be now getting ready to leave. Nick Robinson, our political editor, still with me. At this stage, Nick, I suppose the Palace knows precisely what the Queen is going to be talking to Mr. Brown about after having invited him to form a government.
That's right, because while there are the formalities that she invites him to do it, she also wants a briefing. She wants to know from her new Prime Minister what he has in mind. Remember that although she behaves as a constitutional monarchy who doesn't interfere, she does believe, Her Majesty, in keeping herself well informed. She may wish to know what his policy priorities are, what plans he has for his cabinet, and to build a relationship. They don't know each other well, and there'll be an opportunity too to usher in Mrs. Brown, Sarah, for a more social occasion at the end. And that's why the timing's on today. Quite unpredictable. We don't know how long those conversations precisely will last. What is intriguing to see, the image we're now seeing, though, is it's plain old Mr. Blair again. If we were in the United States, he'd still be the president. President Blair. He loses his title. He's plain old Mr. Blair. It is over for him politically.
So Mr. Blair and his wife in that cavalcade crossing Trafalgar Square, Downing Street, the Mall, Buckingham Palace behind them, and they're off, we understand, to County Durham, to Mr. Blair's constituency. There'll be more of that later on. All eyes are now on the Treasury. We're all expecting Mr. Brown, the Chancellor, to appear in a few seconds' time. And Nick, it's interesting that when we talked about the composition, the likely composition of the cabinet, you were disagreeing with the notion that he'll know exactly who's in what job already.
Well, I'm told that he's been up late last night. He was up late the night before with what was described to me by a close assistant of his as three-dimensional chess. You put one person in a job and you think, oh, that's a problem, because your aim is not just the right people in the right jobs. Have you enough women? Have you enough young people in? He wants to lower the average age to deal with the Tories' complaint. Have you enough Blairites in? Have you reached out? And then suddenly a problem occurs. You say, if I've done that, I've left a problem here. And I am told that the Cabinet is far from over even now, Huw, and that after he arrives here, first will come the international calls, the calls to the President of the United States and France and others to say hello as the new Prime Minister, as well as, of course, a greeting from the Cabinet Secretary and others. Then the real business of saying to the Cabinet Secretary, who he's had dialogue with for some weeks, now, I've been thinking, this is actually what I want to do. And it's a last chance for the civil service machine to say, have you thought of this? That might be a problem. Anyone who thinks cabinet reshuffles are elegant, look at Tony Blair's. Each and every one has gone wrong, not just for personnel reasons, he's found it hard to sack and hire people, but also for machinery of government reasons. Forgot to have a Scottish office at one stage in a reshuffle until someone said, might help if we did have one Prime Minister.
Are we looking at more than 6 or 7 changes in this cabinet, do you think? We're going to look at a very, very new-looking cabinet.
New and different are the phrases that he uses in private about this. But his big decision, of course, is it's no use getting the political credit for new if in weeks you are being attacked for having inexperienced ministers who drop the ball.
Chancellor emerges from the Treasury, shake hands with all the staff who've gathered there, those who've been working with him, some of them for 10 years, since May 1997. There with his wife, as they acknowledge all the applause. This is Britain's new Prime Minister. He's not formally in the job yet, of course, but within the next half hour or so, he will be Britain's new Prime Minister, the 53rd who will have served here in Downing Street. And of course, the man who's been looking at the job, whose ambition it's been to take the job for at least 13 years, but I suspect, Nick, that he's had the ambition for rather longer than that.
Yes, although when we dared to suggest that to him on a News 24 special the other day, he ticked us off and grinned and said, I've not had this ambition forever. After he became an MP, he was happy to say, rather than since birth, which is what many of us had assumed. Yes, he's wanted this job. He's always wanted it. And remember here, when you look at this man, he's been in the public eye since a toddler. He was the son of the church minister, looked at, stared at to see if he'd live up to what his father wants. He was promoted through school so fast he started secondary school at 10, university at 16. Not content with that, he becomes the student rector at 24.
Very warm applause for Gordon Brown as he leaves the Treasury as Chancellor of the Exchequer for the last time. We can discuss maybe a little later on who might replace him there, and the fact that lots of people have been saying they wouldn't envy the person who's going to take over the Treasury with Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, because he'll have a very, very close interest in what goes on. But lots of warm applause, and I think it's fair to say, Nick, that despite all the talk about control freakery and centralising in terms of his attitudes to government, there's a lot of warmth for him in the Treasury, and a lot of respect for his ability.
Both of those things, because he's made the Treasury matter. He's made it the single most important thing. So as he waves goodbye there to the staff lined up, they know they're waving goodbye to an era in which the Treasury mattered more than anywhere else at all. And he has respected people who've challenged him. He's had arguments with them, of course, and is now surrounded by people, almost all of whom were recruited during the Brown years. And quietly, Huw, while this is happening, Treasury officials are lining up, coming in behind us. We're not seeing them, but they're coming, we know, to take key jobs here at number 10. That's how important the Treasury's been to him.
Remarkable scenes at the Treasury as Gordon Brown prepares to leave. The telephone call has obviously been made. He's been summoned by Her Majesty the Queen to an audience at Buckingham Palace where Her Majesty will ask Mr. Brown if he is in a position to form a government. That's the question that they ask. The Queen summons the man or woman most likely to be able to command majority support in the House of Commons. And as the new Labour leader since the weekend, Mr. Brown is clearly that man. And he will accept. And once he's accepted, they'll have a chat about their priorities. He'll come back here to Downing Street where we expect him to say a few words. Carol Walker at the Treasury, what does it look like there?
Well, extraordinary scenes, not just the crowds of staff who've worked with Gordon Brown over the last 10 years. They're giving him the huge cheers and a send-off as he heads off for the palace. But outside, just waiting outside the Treasury, there are crowds, 5 or 6 deep, giving him a big round of applause, shouting their best wishes as Gordon Brown and his wife Sarah head out there to get into the Treasury car. The crowds are cheering. Really a sense of a big occasion here, leaving after a decade, and in just a few minutes from now he'll be there for that audience with the Queen, when, as you were saying, he'll be formally invited to form the next government. And after more than a decade of being Prime Minister in waiting, the long years of that anticipation are over, and Gordon Brown heading off, looking relaxed, looking smiling, as you saw him getting into the car with his wife Sarah there for the short drive to Buckingham Palace. He's been waiting over an hour, of course, since Prime Minister's question time, occupying himself, clearing up some Treasury papers and getting some briefing for those conversations he's going to be having with other world leaders. That, of course, is going to be one of the first tasks ahead of him this afternoon once he finally does become Prime Minister, along with, as you've just been discussing, forming his new government.
Gordon Brown has left the Treasury and is now driving past St James's Park and the Guards Memorial and Horse Guards Parade, turning onto the Mall. And he now, from the car, will have a bird's eye view of Buckingham Palace, which is where he's heading and where Her Majesty the Queen is waiting for him to offer him the opportunity to form the next government. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is there. Nick, this time, a very different kind of audience in prospect.
Yes, though the choreography, Huw, very much the same. The long wait for Gordon Brown is very nearly over. There he is, making his way up the Mall in this convoy, still in making its way through the traffic, escorted by the police there. A different sort of audience, yes, of course, because this is the audience at which he will be invited to form that government, a much more sober and serious audience than the one that Tony Blair will have had a few minutes ago, on which they will have looked back, and perhaps there will have been some sentiment and perhaps even some emotion on Tony Blair's part as he ponders the events of the past 10 years. But now everything passes to this man, the man travelling in the red, I think it's a Vauxhall, which is just coming through as the police outriders stop the traffic as they make their way past the Victoria Memorial, and in a moment they will be coming through the outer gates, the front gates of Buckingham Palace. Quite a good crowd there. We've had a little bit of drizzle this morning, but that's now passed. Overcast and cloudy as Gordon Brown now makes his way across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, and any second now we will see his vehicle as he, with his wife, comes into the quadrangle here, and at the King's door people are prepared to meet him and whisk him upstairs to that audience. Tony Blair was in there for very nearly 25 minutes. He left with a private gift from the Queen, but now Gordon Brown emerges, greeted by the Queen's equerry, Commander Heber Ackland, and Lady Susan Hussey, one of the Queen's senior ladies-in-waiting. He introduces Sarah Brown, and they will both go in. Mrs. Brown, of course, as was the case with Cherie Blair, she will wait downstairs while the Queen's private secretary, Sir Robin Janvrin, takes Gordon Brown upstairs to the Queen's audience room, where she will be waiting, and where, as I've said early this morning, there will be no particular ceremony. It's a very low-key meeting, because that is what it is. There is no kneeling or kissing of hands, although that is the expression that is formally used. But in a few moments, Gordon Brown will be invited by the Queen to form a government, and at that moment he becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Nicholas Witchell, thank you very much. So, Gordon Brown, Chancellor for the past decade, now inside Buckingham Palace, making his way up the staircase, where he will be given an audience with the Queen, and where that invitation will be extended. And as Nick was saying, Britain will have a new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who's been in Parliament since 1983, close colleague of Mr. Blair's for all that time, despite their ups and downs, and the handover is taking place as we speak. We're live on BBC One and on News 24 to cover the process of this handover of power between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. While they're in there, let's join John Sopel once again on College Green.
Huw, thank you very much indeed. Well, here I'm joined by the Health Minister, Andy Burnham, one of those who's been tipped for promotion now that the Brown era is about to start, and by John McTiernan, who has been working in Number 10 with Tony Blair for the past few years. And John McTiernan, I know you were there as Tony Blair left a short time ago. What was it like, the departure?
Well, it was, there's a Number 10 tradition that all the staff line up down the stairs and along the corridor and applaud the Prime Minister on the way out. And we did that, and that was a very moving occasion, because for a lot of us, it's the last time we'll be working in Downing Street, and so it's the end of an era politically, and it was a very moving occasion. There were some people were crying. It was, you know, I had a choke. Everybody was really deeply moved by the moment.
What about the Blairs themselves? How were they?
The Blairs were, as they have been, sort of absolutely confident looking. The whole family were looking fantastic today, and I think that for them, they're going out on a high because they know that politically, what Tony has left now, he's left in his prime. But we've got a new leader for the Labour Party, new Prime Minister, who's absolutely full of all the gifts and talents needs to take on the party. So it's just absolutely perfect.
Did he give any kind of instruction about what degree of emotion or he wanted at the end?
No, he did. No, he didn't. He just he wanted to move on, to move out, to put the final touches to his era, and to let Gordon come in good order.
And Andy Burnham, how would you characterise the change that we're now witnessing? We know that Gordon Brown is in there in the palace. How will it be different?
Well, I think, John, we've got to remember, this is a really historic day for the British Labour Party, that we're actually seeing this transition of power in this spirit. It is a truly fantastic day for the Labour Party. And what Tony's great legacy is for the Labour Party is that there are, not just me, there's lots of people beneath in the strength in depth, if you like, within the Labour Party who are ready now to take on a new era and build what Tony has left us.
Well, John McTiernan, we heard Andy Burnham there talking about it's a great day for the Labour Party. Did you think it would be like this last September?
I don't think anybody in the Labour Party could have been predicted how fantastically the transition's been handled.
That wasn't the question. I said, what did you think it was going to be like last September?
I think I, like everybody in the Labour Party, wanted to see the handover from Gordon Brown, from Tony Blair to Gordon Brown, handled in the best way for the country and for the party. But I think, as Andy said, this has probably been the best 6 weeks for the Labour Party in terms of publicity and our message getting across, our values getting across. And I think that's really what the party wanted at the end of September when we went through party conference.
Yeah, I just wouldn't underestimate the scale of what John's just said, John. I mean, it's a huge achievement. There was a difficult time. There was a time of bitterness where there were some different opinions around, but actually we came through that time. We looked at what was in the right interest of the party, and we've now given ourselves a chance to go forward and really take the country and build on what Tony's achieved. And, you know, we've all put our hearts and souls, haven't we, John, into these last 10 years working with Tony. I look back today to when I was first photocopying his leadership statement the very first day, and John the same. We were involved all the way through. And I think sometimes at home people say, oh, they get emotional on a day like today, but it really truly is, because we put our heart and soul into this work and into this job. And we just today see a Labour legend departing the stage, but our hearts are emotional but glad as well.
OK. Andy Burnham, John McTiernan, both of you, thank you very much indeed. Two of the people who've worked very closely with Tony Blair over the years, but looking forward to the Brown era. Huw, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. I have to say, it's even darker in the skies now. I'd be amazed if it doesn't rain, but let's hope for Gordon Brown's sake that it doesn't pour when he turns up here in Downing Street. They've just erected a set of microphones, so clearly the time will be right for him to make a big statement when he arrives here. We'll be back on BBC One in a few minutes after we've joined our news teams where you are.
Welcome to BBC London News. The mother of a teenage boy stabbed to death in Islington last night has appealed for her son's killers to give themselves up. It's believed the murder of 14-year-old Martin Dinnigan followed on from a fight involving a large number of young people. Our Home Affairs correspondent Guy Smith is live in Islington now. Guy.
Yes, Victoria, over the past week, 7 young Londoners have been murdered, either stabbed or shot. This is the latest. There's still little information as to exactly what happened, but what we do know is that yet another teenager has lost his life. Her teenage son is dead. Lorraine Dinnigan can't believe what's happened. Martin was only 14. Last night, he was stabbed in Islington in what police are describing as a disturbance between a group of youths.
I've just been speaking to one of Martin's friends, and he says it's apparently they were looking at each other in the wrong way.
And it all just kicked off there and then?
And then he says before he knew it, there was lots of boys
all
fighting, and
Martin got stabbed.
He says he just looked and Martin was lying on the ground.
It was 8:30 yesterday evening. Detectives are unclear how many youths were involved. They're still speaking to witnesses. This is becoming an all too familiar scene. Since last Tuesday, 7 Londoners have lost their lives to knife or gun crime. Martin's mother and father believe it's got out of control.
It's just totally horrendous, and it shouldn't be allowed. Why is it happening? Why is it still happening? We're victims. We're other victims. How many more victims is there going to be?
These 2 sisters live near to where Martin was killed. The youngest, who's 13, has been warned by gang members to stay at home.
But she was in the sweet shop at the top of the road. And luckily enough, one of the crew come over to her and said, go home and stay indoors for a couple of days.
What, because it's just too dangerous?
Because obviously now this has happened, there's going to be more trouble occurring. And luckily enough, they was nice enough to come and tell her it's not going to be safe. Stay indoors.
Well, in the last few moments, I've just been told that yet another 14-year-old schoolboy has been stabbed, this time in West London in Acton High Street. He's in hospital, but his injuries are not thought to be life-threatening. A 12-year-old boy has been arrested. Meanwhile, here in Islington, detectives are looking or trying to find the killers or killer of Martin Dinnigan.
Thanks very much indeed, Guy. 7 men and a woman are on trial at the Old Bailey for their role in Britain's biggest ever bank robbery. £53 million was stolen from the Securitas cash depot in Tunbridge last year. Amongst the charges faced by the defendants are conspiracy to kidnap and commit robbery. They deny the charges. 150 police officers have raided addresses in South Kilburn this morning. They made 14 arrests as part of the operation, clamping down on crimes, including drug dealing and firearms offences. Police say they acted in response to information from the local community. Just 1 in 6,000 people in London who drive while using their mobile phones are being caught and fined. According to new research by the Liberal Democrats, there were just 50 fixed penalty notices issued for the offence per day. Drivers in Hammersmith and Fulham were the worst offenders, with 1 in 10 breaking the law.
We're doing an initiative today about people.
The parliamentary boat race gets underway later. It starts just upstream of Lambeth Bridge and finishes in front of the Houses of Parliament. It's the first time the race has been held in 20 years. Well, love them or hate them, parking meters will soon be a thing of the past in central London. Westminster City Council is ripping out all of its meters and replacing them with payment by mobile phone, where drivers have to pre-register and pay by text. A pilot scheme in the borough has had a mixed welcome.
I think it's a good idea, yes. Yeah. It would be nice if there was some meters as well.
Well, in principle, it's absolutely fine, but in practice, if they don't maintain the systems properly, it won't work.
The main problems are that A, you've got to get through to their number, and B, a lot of it is automated. So if you have a problem with it, you still can't get through, therefore you can't park because there's no way of paying.
Well, Councillor Danny Chalkley is in charge of parking at Westminster Council. Thanks for joining us. It sounds like good news for you, but causing a lot more hassles for some drivers, we hear.
I don't agree. We've been undertaking a pilot of what's been a very successful pay-by-phone scheme in Westminster. We've undertaken a public consultation of thousands of motorists that use the service, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, with over 80% of motorists regarding it to be a benefit, and that's why we're now taking the decision to roll it out to other parts of the city. But there are some issues briefly. A 20p transaction cost, a maximum that is, 10p for the text to top up the service, and network charges on the mobile call. These are all the hidden costs people might not know about briefly. Well, we've made it very clear what the charges are before people use the service. The service charge we apply to support the pilot that we've developed. We're not proposing to continue that as we roll it out across the rest of Westminster. When will this rollout happen, and have you got anything in place in case the trial isn't successful, it doesn't work over the summer? We do have a contingency plan, but we're proposing to start removing the meters from those areas that we're not currently piloting from October of this year, and people will see the last of our meters removed at the end of next year.
Well, I guess it'll take most people a bit of time to get used to a new system, but for now, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Well, it's time to have a look at the weather for this afternoon. Here's Thomas Schaffenacker.
Hi Victoria. For most of us today is actually going to be a reasonable day. There'll be some sunshine around. It's a little bit on the cool side with some showers too, and it's cool because the wind's coming in out of the north, so that inherently is quite a cool direction for most of us. So the satellite picture shows quite a bit of cloud across the country today, but it's also breaking up, so allowing those sunny spells to come through from time to time as well. So let's have a look at the weather then for the course of the afternoon. Well, any showers that do brew will probably brew anywhere across our region through the course of the afternoon, but I think we're talking about mostly dry weather as we go through the day. Top temperature around about 18 degrees Celsius with the winds, well, mostly from a westerly direction, but northwesterly at times. Showers for a time this evening as well. And then tonight will turn very chilly. That's because we will have clear skies virtually all through the night. So tomorrow morning starts off sunny, but cool. Temperatures in central London 9 degrees, 6 degrees or even lower than that in some rural spots very early on Thursday. Now the day starts off nice. There'll be a lot of sunshine. In fact, the first half of the day will be okay, and then cloud amounts will increase as we go towards the second half of the day, but I think it'll stay dry. But beyond Thursday afternoon into Friday, it looks as though rain's on the way, and there's actually an early warning from the Met Office for more heavy rain to come during the course of the weekend.
Doesn't sound like very good news. Thanks very much. Well, on our main programme at 6:30 tonight, as the Blairs move to their new home in Connaught Square, we'll be talking to locals about what their new neighbourhood has to offer. And we want to hear from you. What do you want Gordon Brown to do for London? You can email us at the usual address. It should be on your screen now. Well, that's just about it for now from me. Asad Ahmad will be here with our main programme at 6:30. But for now, from all of us, do have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Sophie, welcome back to Westminster, and the noise is off, by the way. They're testing the microphones here in Downing Street, ready for Gordon Brown to return and make his first statement to the nation as Prime Minister. At the moment, Mr Brown and his wife are at Buckingham Palace for that first audience with Her Majesty the Queen. We're covering live on BBC One and News 24 the handover of power between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Mr Blair has already had his final audience with Her Majesty, and he's now on his way to his constituency in Sedgefield in County Durham, where we expect him to confirm that he's bringing his parliamentary career to an end as well, that he's giving up as an MP, and that will, of course, will trigger a by-election, which will be one of the first electoral tests for Gordon Brown as Prime Minister. Lots of talk today about the kind of challenge that Mr Brown faces. Big question, what direction will he take once he becomes Prime Minister, once he enters that door within the next half hour? Our political correspondent Robin Brandt assesses the challenges ahead.
For 10 years, Gordon Brown has been the man in charge here, every week in this door with one single issue on his mind: economic stability. It's dominated, but now all that is going to change.
Getting through the gate to number 10 was only the first battle. Now he'll be in the spotlight every day, questioned about every judgment he makes in every area of government policy. Britain's commitment abroad is one of the first priorities. Will there be a change of direction under Prime Minister Brown?
We're in responsibility in Basra, but we're trying to get economic development there so that it is possible for the Iraqis to take over their own security and then for the economic development of that province to happen.
Gordon has huge knowledge of and engagement with the United States of America and influential people going back decades. Because of that, he can be more conditional, he can withdraw a little, he can become more distant without anyone ever sensibly being able to accuse him of being anti-American.
Gordon Brown has declared the NHS his immediate priority. He wants better care out of hours, but a pay squeeze is coming for the staff.
I want an NHS that is there for people when you need it.
I think the difficulty is that there are still some very hard decisions to be made, not least about moving a lot of care out of traditional hospitals, sending them off to specialist centres or down into local communities.
Politicians and the people don't see eye to eye, and the new Prime Minister wants to reverse that. He has one overarching priority. After Iraq and cash for honours, he wants to restore faith in his government.
I better let you get on with this.
There certainly is questions around trust. We've got to re-establish that relationship between not just the public, actually, but the Labour Party in the country, the trade unions, the ordinary members, of course, with Parliament.
Gordon Brown knows there is a significant amount of work ahead. He's got to prove he's different to Tony Blair. He's got to take on David Cameron's Conservatives. The next few months are crucial if he's to be more than just a short-term Prime Minister. Robin Brandt, BBC News, Westminster.
Robin Brandt with that assessment, and of course the talk here is what exactly will the Chancellor, as he was, the Prime Minister as he now is, have to say when he arrives in Downing Street. The microphones are in place for him to make that statement. And just have a look at the scene a few minutes ago, around 15 minutes ago actually, when he left the Treasury, just on the flank of St James's Park, when he received the call from the Palace to that audience with Her Majesty the Queen. Mr Brown on his way at around, well, it was between 10 and 5 to 2 today. And we expect the audience to last in the region of half an hour. But of course, these things are not done to precise timings. How can they be when it's a new Prime Minister receiving his commission, if you like, or his appointment from the Queen? So Mr Brown arrived with his wife Sarah, and we understand that Mrs Brown would have waited in an adjacent room while the formal audience was taking place, and that she would then be invited to join Mr Brown and Her Majesty for a chat at the end of the audience before they make their way back to Downing Street. Mr Brown was greeted by two of the senior officials at Buckingham Palace. And he's still in there. That was a short while ago. This is the scene right now. Cars are there, waiting for Britain's new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, to emerge. And I think we've got quite a few minutes yet before he does. And of course, nowhere in Britain will they be looking at these pictures with greater pride, greater enthusiasm and greater happiness than in Gordon Brown's home patch of Kirkcaldy. And our correspondent Lorna Gordon is there. Lorna, what's being said there today?
Huw, you're absolutely right. It's very quiet here in the centre of Kirkcaldy this afternoon, but there is a sense of very low-key pride. We've been out and about speaking to some of the locals. They're immensely proud that a local boy has done good because, of course, Gordon Brown, it's an often used cliche, was the son of the manse. He went to the local school here. It is this area which made him the man and indeed the politician he is now. Earlier today we were speaking to a local school teacher who also went to school with Gordon Brown, and he said even at that early age he was involved in a certain degree with politics. But of course, while there is a lot of local pride, there is a small degree of disquiet. A couple of hours ago there was a small protest of about 40 or 50 people, members of the PCS union. They were saying, Chancellor, yeah, he did okay. We're a little unhappy with some of the things that went through under his tenure as Chancellor. But they said if he wants to be a good Prime Minister, then he better start listening to us now.
Well, how important is it that Mr Brown is seen to, as he's done in the past, spend lots of weekends, most weekends, in his constituency, in his home patch? Do they lay lots of store on that?
Well, yes, he is perceived as a very good constituency MP. Most people have a very good opinion of what he's done for the local area. And, of course, he's hugely supportive of the local football team. If you looked at his biography on the Treasury website, he said his interests were football, films and tennis. And really, it's football that formed him with his support of the local team, Wraith Rovers. He was influential in a big buyout a few years ago. But in terms of how he operates as an MP. He does keep up contacts with the local school, and he does take a keen interest in what's happening in this area, Kirkcaldy, the area in which not only is it his constituency, but it's also the area in which he grew up.
A final thought, Lorna, on the whole Scottish question, if I can put it like that, because it is a factor that lots of people debate. How has it been perceived there? The Scottish National Party made a lot of running in local elections there, in recent elections to the Parliament, saying that, you know, Mr Brown was a British politician who in some way may have turned his back on his home ground. How is that seen?
I think that really will be the key question in terms of the Scottish electorate over the next couple of years. The SNP are saying they have a good relationship. I heard one of the ministers talking this morning, John Swinney. Certainly Gordon Brown did phone Alex Salmond to congratulate him on becoming First Minister, but it is inevitable that there will be some fault lines, disagreements along the way, because there are so many areas which are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, areas like education and health, and of course those are areas which, as Prime Minister, he will play a key role. So it will play with the Scottish electorate, but perhaps even more crucially, it will play with the English electorate as well, that a Scottish Prime Minister will be leading on legislation over which he has no control in the country from which he comes from.
Lorna, many thanks. Lorna Gordon in Kirkcaldy. If you've just joined us on BBC One and BBC News 24, a warm welcome to you. The handover of power between Gordon Brown and between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown is taking place as we speak. Mr Brown is at the Palace. He's having an audience with Her Majesty the Queen. We expect him back here in Downing Street in just a few moments' time, because he still hasn't emerged from the rooms there above the King's entrance in Buckingham Palace. The Prime Ministerial car is waiting to bring him back to Downing Street. Nick Robinson, our political editor, is still with me here. And Nick, it's interesting at this stage that, listen to what Lorna was saying there, that you know, he will have to think very carefully about the cabinet balance with Scottish members.
He will have to think very carefully, because it's not the fact that he's a Scot, it's that he represents a Scottish constituency after devolution. In other words, there will be voters in England, and there will be certainly political opponents, not least the Conservative Party, who will say, hold on, Mr Brown, these measures that you're introducing with your majority don't apply to your own constituents, and they can't hold you to account. We don't have a presidential system. You can only vote against or for Gordon Brown in his constituency, to be literal-minded about it, and they won't, and that will be a controversy. And therefore we'll have to consider that in the balancing cabinet, made much easier, of course, by the retirement of John Reid as Home Secretary. We believe that Alistair Darling will be confirmed as Chancellor of the Exchequer, quite possibly tonight. I suspect it will be the only appointment, if we get any, that we hear about this evening. But yes, he will have to be careful that his other friends around him are not Scots in such prominent positions that it causes a row.
So we're still awaiting for that departure from Buckingham Palace. It'll only take a few minutes, of course, for Mr Brown to make his way from the Palace along the Mall and probably down through the Admiralty Arch, down onto Whitehall and into the main entrance of Downing Street. Few minutes maybe from Buckingham Palace, that's all it'll take. They'll clear the crowds, they'll clear the traffic, and that Prime Ministerial car will get there very, very swiftly. In the meantime, as we wait for Mr Brown to emerge from the Palace, let's join John Sopel once again on College Green.
Huw, thank you very much indeed. Yes, you're talking there about balancing what a new Brown cabinet will look like. Well, one of the criteria that he's going to have to meet is the balance between male and female members of the cabinet, and one person who is strongly tipped for promotion is Yvette Cooper. I was going to say currently the Housing Minister. Are you technically still a minister at the moment?
Well, I'm not a constitutional expert, John, but as I understand it, the Prime Minister has resigned for all of us. So, as I understand it, it's the Queen and the Civil Service are in charge until Gordon Brown formally becomes Prime Minister and forms a new government.
Right. What are the balances that Gordon Brown has to get when appointing this government?
Well, he's just going to be thinking about the best people for the job, about, you know, the things that he cares about most in terms of the future challenges of the country and who best to fill them. So, you know, those are the things I know he'll have been thinking about for some time, and obviously announcing his decisions either later today or tomorrow over the next few days. But
we heard Nick Robinson, our political editor, there talking about, you know, the balance between Scottish and non-Scottish, male, female, young, old, Blairites, non-Blairites. I mean, everything has to be weighed very carefully, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and obviously he's going to want a government that reflects the nation, but he's also going to want a government of people who are the best people for the job. He's talked about, you know, the most talented people for the job. I think that's what he'll be thinking about now.
Now, I want to ask your reflections on the day, because it has been an extraordinary day. First of all, Prime Minister's questions, because I know you were in the House for that, and the reception that we saw Tony Blair getting at the end.
It was. I think it was a very historic moment. The fact that the whole House stood up and paid tribute and really, you know, recognised the huge contribution that he's made over 10 years as the Prime Minister of this country. And it was very fitting that I think that the final tribute was about Northern Ireland and his role in bringing peace to Northern Ireland and the contribution that that has made really for all of our futures.
Yes, you kind of kept on waiting for Ian Paisley to have a dig at the end of the fight. You felt
he didn't.
certain, and there was none. It was just thank you.
And I think that's really how the whole House felt. You know, the contribution he's made. We are a much more prosperous country 10 years on. We've also seen great improvements in public services. Northern Ireland obviously are particularly important, but also I think we're probably a more tolerant country, more at ease with ourselves than 10 years ago.
The other interesting thing he said at the end there, which was a non-partisan point, and he said, although at times at Westminster there is low skullduggery, for the most part, people's motives are noble.
Well, I think that's right, and I think people go into politics because they want to change the world or because they believe in things. And, you know, people can disagree with Tony Blair. They may not always have liked decisions that he took, but actually he took them in good faith, and he took them because he thought they were the right things to do for this country.
And now I want to take you to the moment where we saw the pictures there of Gordon. We can see Gordon Brown's, the Prime Minister's car, Gordon Brown's car outside Buckingham Palace now. I mean, you've been very close to Gordon Brown. Your husband is Ed Balls, who was Gordon Brown's senior advisor and another person tipped for very high office. What do you feel about this moment finally arriving?
Well, I think it's a huge opportunity. I think there's a lot of energy now behind Gordon. He's obviously been a great Chancellor over the last 10 years, and we've seen how much employment has grown. We've seen the improvements in investment that have taken place as a result. But I think we also feel that, you know, it's time for the change now. It's time to move on and to move forward, and there's a great sense of optimism. It's a big contrast, really. If you think, you know, the last time we had prime ministers hand over to each other in government, you know, was from Margaret Thatcher to John Major, and that was a vicious process. It was a very nasty process, a very divisive process, and probably the Conservative Party are still suffering as a result of that. This has been a very optimistic process, actually very stable and orderly, as people said they wanted it to be, and I think that will serve the country well.
Yvette Cooper, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you get a job, because you just told us you haven't got one now. Okay, Huw, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. Gordon Brown still at the Palace. The audience has lasted, we reckon, getting on for 25 minutes, and it could well last for a few minutes longer. As Nick Robinson was explaining a short while ago, it's not just the appointment of Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, it's also the chance for the Queen to canvass some opinions and to explore what Mr. Brown may have in mind in terms of appointments, if he's made decisions on some of the big appointments, and some of his priorities in terms of policy. That's what the Queen would normally expect to discuss, and it's certainly something that she would be discussing with the Prime Minister from week to week. She's been doing it with Tony Blair, she's been doing it with Prime Ministers going back to Winston Churchill back in the early 1950s, and that is quite a remarkable thing to think, that the Queen has been the continuing factor, the continuing element across half a century of history here in Britain. It's a remarkable achievement, and that's what Gordon Brown is confronting in the Palace today, all that experience and all that expertise. Nick Robinson is with me still, and we're just waiting for the Chancellor to emerge as Britain's new Prime Minister. We see that there's another car now, Nick, another vehicle in the courtyard of the Palace, and that looks like security.
Yes, and that is the beginning of a huge change for Mr. Brown. He came in that rather modest red car from the Treasury. That's gone. He's got his grand Prime Ministerial car, but also that following security vehicle as well. And he will find it a change. Of course, he's had security here as a senior politician, but having not been the Home Secretary or Northern Irish Secretary or Foreign Secretary in the past, or even Defence, he has not required the high level of security that others have grown used to, and it is a shock to politicians. There are things they think they can do and they're told they're not. Politically, it's awkward too. I was told a story the other day in which some of those around Mr Brown said, oh, well, he doesn't want to be seen doing that. He'd rather not be seen in that car. And the police officers turned and said, I'm sorry, we don't ask your opinion. This is not a political discussion as to what we do. We decide, even if it's the Prime Minister, how he goes, where he goes, in what manner. Now, of course, as Prime Minister, there's a capacity to overrule. We heard the story from Lord Stevens a while ago that Tony Blair took a decision not to have security when he thought he should have at a big public event. But it will be a huge change in his life, and one that I don't imagine, like anybody else, he'll enjoy.
Well, that security is in place already, ready for Mr Brown to emerge. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell is at the palace. Nick, what are the signs there?
Huw, actually, so he's getting longer than Tony Blair got. No sign of an imminent departure, though I can't imagine that it can be many minutes away. And as you've been saying, the unarmoured red Vauxhall has disappeared and given way to that heavily armoured black Daimler, the prime ministerial vehicle, which is waiting there, and not far away I was counting 6 protection officers, so just augmenting what Nick Robinson was saying about the change in lifestyle that of course goes with the change in job, that very much now part of Gordon Brown's life. He will have been in that audience room, he will have been invited by the Queen to form that government, and assuming that he has accepted, he will have been joined by his wife Sarah, and they will have had this time to discuss, of course, what his plans will be and the various challenges that he now faces. The Queen, of course, keenly interested in all of those issues, bringing to bear, as you've been saying, the 55 years during which she has seen, or is now seeing, her 11th Prime Minister of her reign. And she has the right, of course, to advise Prime Ministers, and she exercises that right. We believe that she has a good relationship with Gordon Brown. They've met on many occasions, obviously, during the 10 years during which Gordon Brown has been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and indeed, of course, he's frequently come to Buckingham Palace to brief the Queen on Treasury and economic matters. He comes, as a matter of course, as Chancellor to brief the Queen every year about the contents of his budget. And my impression is that they get on well. They have, I think, many similar qualities, a sense of honour and duty and those sorts of things. So this conversation still continuing with Gordon Brown and his wife Sarah. And I think the Queen always is drawn to people of a Scottish background, and Gordon Brown's Scottish background is something that is a very important element in his life. So we would expect, certainly within the next few minutes, that he would be emerging and climbing into that vehicle there and making his way out of Buckingham Palace and back to Downing Street.
Had lots of emails from viewers asking questions about the process itself. Will there be anyone else in the room for the audience? We understand there won't be, is that right?
Initially not, no. It is just the Queen and the person whom she is about to invite to form a government. That's why it's been rather difficult, actually, to check all this stuff about do they kiss hands and so on. And I can tell you that the BBC has been to quite some lengths to check, and we have had it from, shall I just say, a very high source, that there is no kissing of hands or kneeling, as I've been saying this morning. They do kiss hands, actually, at the first meeting that a new Prime Minister attends of the Privy Council. That is when this brushing of the monarch's hand does still take place. That occurs for any new member of the Privy Council or any new Prime Minister. But it does not take place at this audience at which the Queen invites a politician to form a government. And, of course, as I've been saying, by convention, the Queen extends that invitation to the person who can command the confidence of the House of Commons, so by definition that must be the politician who leads the largest party in the House of Commons.
Nick, we'll be back with you very shortly, but interesting to hear you talking there again and clarifying the position on the kissing of hands, which is this constitutional term. Unfortunately, of course, people have had a slightly different impression, partly because of what they see at the movies, and we did see a very famous image of the kissing of hands in the recent film The Queen. Let's have a look at that.
I believe we have some business to attend to.
Of course.
Your Majesty, my party has won the election, and so I come now to ask your permission to form a government.
No, Mr. Blair. Mr. Blair, I asked the question. The duty falls upon me as your sovereign to invite you to become Prime Minister and to form a government in my name. If you agree, the custom is to say yes.
Yes.
Well, lots of us saw the film and enjoyed it. Nick Robinson is still with me. Nick, I think it's fair to say, though, that if that was Mr. Blair joining the Privy Council, was it or not? Because he may have been actually Privy Council as leader of the opposition. So the kissing of hands is a bit of a hybrid one there.
Yes, it's curious, though. I mean, I used that clip on the 10 o'clock news and it was repeated on our internet broadcast and elsewhere yesterday because, of course, we will never get cameras to witness the actual moment. I thought it was a way of showing to people. Interestingly, I did it because I've been told by insiders here how precise and accurate that film was. There are historical details all wrong, but they say it captures the mood between Downing Street and the Palace in a way. I've heard that from the most senior civil servants in the land who said that. But it is interesting that though he got onto one knee, we understand, and did kiss the monarch's hand, Gordon Brown will not. So sorry, viewers, if I misled you yesterday.
Nick, thank you very much. Well, just a reminder that you're watching BBC News 24, you're watching BBC One for this special programme on the handover of power between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. Of course, Gordon Brown in there now, accepting the invitation from the Queen to become Prime Minister. Many, many more people watching online around the world. This coverage being streamed on the BBC's website, and that, of course, is a great way for people across the world to join this coverage today, and a very, very warm welcome to them wherever you are, because it's a big day here in Britain, and there'll be lots of people on the international stage, of course, focusing on this too, given Britain's profile in world events over the past few years. John Sokol is once again on College Green. John, let's join you.
Huw, thanks very much indeed. Well, let me talk now to Kitty Usher, who's a parliamentary private secretary, and I suspect, hoping there may be a phone call tomorrow from number 10?
I think me and about 300 other people have got their phones on, and it's a bit like Chinese water talk show, wondering whether the call will come. So,
will you sleep well tonight?
Yes, extremely well. I
You
always
sure?
do. Yes, absolutely.
You won't be anxious thinking at any moment now Downing Street could ring and say the Prime Minister would like to see you?
Absolutely not. And if they ring after a certain hour, they certainly won't get through.
Right. How do you see today the significance of the passing of the baton from Blair to Brown?
I think it's a very exciting day, actually, tinged with sadness, obviously, that a leader that has a huge amount of respect has retired, but certainly speaking for other Labour backbenchers and MPs, we have a sort of great feeling of optimism, and the renewal that we've been talking about doing in government is now taking place, and I'm extremely excited about what that means for our party and for the country.
Was the goodbye a bit long and kind of melodramatic, really?
Well, in a sense, it wasn't very melodramatic because it took place over such a long period of time. It was kind of in slow motion and there wasn't much excitement, I guess. But I think we have to pay tribute to Tony Blair for going on the day pretty much of his own choosing. He hasn't been forced out in a rather undignified way like previous Prime Ministers were. And so we were able to respond graciously, and he was able to be gracious in Parliament today. And it was a very moving and fitting tribute, and he was treated with great warmth from all sides of the House of Commons today.
OK, and if we were to ask you the question, how will a Brown administration differ from a Blair administration? What's the answer?
I think in many ways it's building on the huge amount of work that has been done, and in a sense Tony Blair's work was building on the work that Neil Kinnock and John Smith had done for our party and being ready to lead our country in the right way. But Gordon Brown is a man who has had a lot of time to think about what he wants to do. He gives me the impression that he's bursting with ideas. It's almost like policies are coming out of his ears at the moment. He set out some of the broad changes that he wants to see in terms of making our health service more democratic and accountable, in terms of giving people greater rights to have the education that they need that fits them up to the age of 18, an apprenticeship or a place at college, so that nobody has to feel that if they haven't got to a certain stage at 16 that they somehow have to stop learning. And obviously in housing, he called that the great mission of our century, of our generation, to give everybody the right to have affordable housing and to involve people crucially in the decisions that are being made. And that means more power to Parliament and more power through Parliament to British people, and more power to the Labour Party to be involved in every single step of the journey that we're making. And I think that's extremely exciting.
But how does that distinguish him from David Cameron, who is saying very similar things?
I think change the blindingly obvious for everyone to see. Gordon Brown is a conviction politician. He's talked about his moral compass. His values are in line with the Labour Party values of equality and fairness and breaking the link between class and people's opportunities. And I think David Cameron, as we've seen from the letter that Quentin Davis wrote yesterday, is an insincere, PR-driven, sort of chameleon-type politician. And I don't think the two are comparable in any way whatsoever.
OK, Kitty Asher, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope the phone call comes to you from Downing Street. An awful lot of MPs will be waiting by their telephones or Blackberries or whatever it happens to be, just to wait for that call, which we'll expect to come in the next 24, 36 hours. Anyway, Huw, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. Yes, we're ready, of course, for this departure from Buckingham Palace, which should happen now within the next few minutes. Gordon Brown's been in there for well over half an hour. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is there. Nick, any signs of any preparations for departure?
Well, there aren't actually, Huw. No, I make it about 40 minutes now, which is certainly rather longer than we had anticipated. So they're certainly having a very good chat about, well, all kinds of things. And one must assume that most of the time is being spent just with the Queen and Prime Minister Brown, covering the range of issues, obviously, that he will be dealing with, the many challenges that he faces. But at the moment, no, there is no sign of movement. The cars are in place there, the Prime Ministerial vehicle and the escort vehicle, but we would normally get some sense of movement when the equerry emerges and Lady Susan Hussey, the lady in waiting to the Queen, they would normally just come down now. What's this now? Here are some people emerging. A press officer, which is not necessarily a terribly promising sign. So I think at this point, although I see one of the security men has got out of his vehicle, it can't be too many more minutes, but clearly they are not to be hurried. The monarch wants a good chat with her new Prime Minister, and perhaps the new Prime Minister wants a good chat with his monarch, who has seen no fewer than 10 of his predecessors, going back to 1952, and Winston Churchill. So the Queen, very experienced, as we know, in these matters, and with all sorts of perhaps gentle words of advice that she might wish to offer. But there they are, they're looking inwards through the King's door, waiting and watching. But at this precise moment, there is no sign that I can see of an imminent departure.
Nick, it's worth pointing out that most of the audiences, of course, do take place at the palace, but some of them take place elsewhere, not least in the summer, and it does fit in sometimes with the Queen's own holiday pattern.
Yes, the Queen, of course, goes to Balmoral for several months during the summer, and always there is an invitation to the Prime Minister to spend a weekend at Balmoral. That's always in September. That, I'm sure, is something that Gordon Brown and his wife will enjoy. It was never clear whether the Blairs entirely enjoyed it. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it was always the indication or the impression that Mrs. Blair did not enjoy it. I think she found all of that Highland weather and tweediness of the Balmoral estate not quite to her liking, but the Blairs went up there and spent that weekend with the Queen and her family in September at Balmoral, and that, of course, was an opportunity for, and is an opportunity for, the Prime Minister to spend rather more time with the Queen in a rather more domestic setting than the weekly audience at Buckingham Palace. And, of course, Tony Blair was not as perhaps some people said as conscientious about those weekly audiences as other Prime Ministers, but that perhaps was a symptom of the increasing pressures on a modern Prime Minister with the calls on his or indeed her time. But certainly he moved the weekly audience to a Wednesday night, the same day, of course, as he always had to be in London for Prime Minister's questions, and that gave him greater flexibility for the rest of the week. Now that, I'm sure, is perhaps a practice that Gordon Brown will continue, the weekly audience on a Wednesday evening, but there were occasions when Tony Blair was missing those audiences, and certainly here at the Palace that caused some comment. They felt that he perhaps wasn't taking those audiences sufficiently seriously, although it should be stressed that Tony Blair's relationship with the Queen was always a very good one. He was a staunch supporter, or remains a staunch supporter of the monarchy, and I think the personal relationship between Tony Blair and Queen Elizabeth was an excellent one, and I think that everyone would expect that the same would be the case with Gordon Brown and the Queen. As I've been saying, they've met each other on many, many occasions over the past 10 years. And certainly, if the length of this audience is anything to go by, they seem to be firm friends and allies already. They don't seem to want to leave each other's company.
Nick, we'll be back with you as soon as there are any signs there, but for the moment, thank you very much. Here in Downing Street, let me explain what we're now expecting. They will open the gates as soon as Mr. Brown is on his way from the palace, which we do expect in the next few minutes. After the audience with the Queen, he'll come straight to Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he'll then be in a position to make a statement here in Downing Street to the media who are massed here. Many, many hundreds of members of the press and media in Downing Street today, ready for the great arrival of Britain's new Prime Minister and, of course, the statement, which will mark the tone, if you like, of the start of this Brown premiership. Very, very great interest in precisely what he has to say, what his message to the nation will be. We're staying on the pictures, but we'll go and join John Sopel once again.
Huw, thank you very much. Yes, and I'm joined here on College Green by Sir Mingus Campbell, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Sir Ming, I hope you'll forgive us, but when we see Gordon Brown emerge from Buckingham Palace, we'll obviously want to go there. But how do you assess today?
Well, it wasn't the kind of parliamentary occasion people expected. And if you think about it, it's been a resignation in instalments, and perhaps the longest coronation in history. It was rather flat. People were concerned, I think, to give Tony Blair a good send-off, rather than to challenge him in the kind of way that's typical of Prime Minister's question. And of course the really interesting thing, like the Sherlock Holmes dog which didn't bark in the night, was there was absolutely no mention of Quentin Davis, the Tory MP who defected last night to give Mr. Brown an enormous coup.
These pictures of the standing ovation that he got,
Yeah.
I mean, that was extraordinary. I've never seen that in the House.
There had been, it's not supposed to be part of the procedures of the House, but if you remember when Betty Boothroyd was the first woman speaker, stood down, there was a standing ovation. And when Robin Cook made that famous resignation speech, a number of colleagues round about him stood up. But by tradition, the House is supposed to say, "Hear, hear," and stay firmly on its bottoms.
Yes. I suppose a mark, though, of the extent to which he has dominated British politics for a decade.
For 10 years, well, for more than that, because if you remember the last years of the major government, the Conservatives really were in retreat, and Tony Blair was dominating British politics as leader of the opposition. And
Now, while we wait for him to emerge, I have to ask you this. I mean, all the talk's going to be on the reshuffle. There aren't going to be any Liberal Democrats in this government tomorrow, are there?
I would be very no, they're not.
You started off.
Very surprised.
I'd be very surprised.
I'd be very surprised if there were. No, there aren't.
You're leaving it with no ambiguity. No, there won't.
No, there won't be.
Right. What went on?
Well, I've answered questions about this on several occasions. I've done a number of interviews, particularly for the BBC. But if I can sum it up, in the course of a conversation, Gordon Brown made a suggestion to me. I considered the suggestion, I took advice about it, but I decided it wasn't appropriate.
And I interviewed Gordon Brown on the weekend, where he said the version of events that you had said to him no Liberal Democrat would serve, and then he went to Paddy Ashdown afterwards, was a complete travesty of what happened.
Well, I'm not getting into who said what and to whom when. I mean, we've moved into a new era of politics. We have a new Prime Minister, but we have a Prime Minister who comes into number 10 Downing Street having had more influence over domestic policy than any other Chancellor of the Exchequer probably in history. Someone who carries all of the Blair government with him. It's been a Blair-Brown government, and we must now get him to address the issues which affect the daily lives of people in this country.
Yes, you represent neighbouring constituencies, you travel up and down quite often. Has your relationship been damaged by any of this?
Not at all. We're both grown. Listen, Scotland's a political village. Malcolm Rifkin, a Conservative, is a friend of mine. I occasionally travel up and down with him. No, Gordon Brown's a friend of mine. He's a man who's got a towering intellect. That doesn't mean to say I share his political views.
Sir Mingus Campbell, grateful to you. Thanks very much for joining us here on College Green. We still await the emergence of Gordon Brown, our new Prime Minister. Huw, back to you.
John, many thanks. And for viewers joining us here on BBC One and BBC News 24, we are covering the handover of power between the outgoing Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and the incoming Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. It's happening as we speak. Mr. Blair has already been in to see the Queen and has resigned, and The outgoing Chancellor, Gordon Brown, is in the palace right now, talking to the Queen and accepting the invitation to form a government. And what we now expect in terms of the timetable, if you like, although it's slipping a bit, is that Mr. Brown will leave the palace within a few minutes, come straight back here to Downing Street, make a statement to the media here, and explain maybe what his principles of government will be, set the tone for his government, and then go into number 10 and get on with the job of constructing his cabinet and his ministerial team, which will be quite a job. Nick Robinson, our political editor, with me here, watching the events, following them. It's such a big day, Nick, and really we're expecting, I would have thought, quite a memorable statement from Mr. Brown. He'll have thought long and hard about what he'll say.
He will. He's had plenty of time to do just that, and it should, as you were saying earlier, capture the mood, capture the spirit. This isn't an opportunity to list his policies. It isn't a moment at which he says, I've got 17 priorities. It is a moment to try to sum up in a few words the type of man he is, the type of Prime Minister he wants to be, the type of country he wants to lead. He knows that he has to do it briefly enough that it will be used on television news bulletins, not just here, but around the world, and will sum him up. Now, of course, you can always have a wry laugh, though. Margaret Thatcher, of course, quoted St Francis of Assisi. She has many, many qualities before anybody writes in or rings or phones, but a healer was perhaps not the main thing that people regarded as one of her principal qualities, and yet it's what she said on the doorstep. But it's revealing of what Prime Ministers hope to be remembered by, hope to believe in.
It's that image which stays with you, the great beaming smile of Ted Heath, the quiet look of Harold Wilson with a pipe. It's that image which is all important.
That's right, and he's been told, Gordon Brown, I know, in recent nights by allies, it'll never be as good as this again. You do realise that? Because in a sense he's had all the fun of being the next Prime Minister. None of the intense media scrutiny, none of the pressure of events coming across him, the ability to make the political weather, that coup yesterday with the Tory MP coming across the floor, making his cabinet now, it gets harder from now on. So he has to enjoy this, and he has to make sure it says something about himself. And remember, for Gordon Brown, that is as much about personality as politics, because the thing that has stopped him getting to the top and has slowed his rise to the top finally was character. The suggestion that he was, in the famous phrase that we think came from Tony Blair, but we'll never know, psychologically flawed, that he was, in another phrase, a Stalinist, said the former Cabinet Secretary. Part of what he has to do today, and he's been doing it in recent weeks, hasn't he, is say, you got me all wrong, that isn't me, I'm different.
Will we see something different when he arrives in Downing Street? Will there be a family occasion on this doorstep, or will it be a very different entry to the Blairs?
Well, very different indeed, because remember they had people lining up and down this street here, Downing Street, waving flags. We thought they were members of the public. We later managed to spot people like David Miliband, the Environment Secretary, who'd had pager messages telling them to turn up here, being handed a flag. None of that. He'll be here on his own with his wife, not with his two boys. They won't be here. I'm sure they'll be watching. I wonder if they're one of the windows up here. They might have the opportunity. But no, the family got together at Manchester on Sunday for his formal election as Labour leader. His two brothers, Andrew and John, were there too. And so he will have not his family here, just his wife, and then back to business as quickly as he can.
It was a very exciting moment, Nick, when Mr. Brown emerged from the Treasury, and that was getting on for an hour ago. Let's have a look at the pictures again, because they're worth seeing. There were hundreds of Treasury staff there. Lots of them, of course, long-standing civil servants, and there will be viewers wondering whether civil servants should be out applauding warmly as the Chancellor leaves, but it was one of those occasions.
Yeah, and one of those occasions for a really good reason. He's the longest-serving Chancellor ever. Most of them will have got their jobs, not thanks to him, but while he was there. They regard themselves as working in the Brown Treasury. Even the physical fabric of that building has been transformed since he was there. He actually got rid of one half of the Treasury, sold it to a private company in this brand new building you're seeing there with the balconies and the atrium. So the Treasury really do feel they own a bit of Gordon Brown, that he's their guy, and therefore leaving him. There's a bit of nervousness that maybe they'll go into the shadows again in Whitehall terms.
Well, no shadow certainly at Buckingham Palace, because we are now told that the departure is imminent. Let's have a closer look and join Nick Witchell once again. Nick, some movement.
Some movement, Huw, yes. It's not far short of an hour now, so we're already seeing some evidence of a different style of things. And yeah, we are getting definitely some movement now. Yeah, the security men moving into position. And there we see Gordon Brown with Sir Robin Janvrin. Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, having been invited by the Queen to form a government, saying farewell to Lady Susan Hussey. Robin Janvrin there on the right, Queen's Private Secretary. Gordon Brown, Prime Minister, making his way now to the armoured Prime Ministerial Jaguar. He gets in, and in a moment he will be making his way from Buckingham Palace here to 10 Downing Street to make that statement and to start putting his finishing touches to the formation of the government, the Brown government, and this new era now in British politics. The Queen's officials just watching him go as the vehicles now move out into the outer courtyard after a 55-minute, I'm told, a 55-minute audience. Well, I can't remember one of that length for a Prime Minister to be invited to form a government, but there we are. Many things to discuss, and many things now for this man, Gordon Brown, the determined Scot, whose lifelong ambition has now been realised. Many things now for him to put his formidable mind to. Gordon Brown leaves Buckingham Palace as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
The Prime Minister, Britain's new Prime Minister, making his way along the Mall, retracing his steps of an hour ago, joined there, of course, by the Prime Ministerial security car. They're on their way up the Mall towards Admiralty Arch, and very soon they will be here in Downing Street. Gordon Brown will be here to tell the nation that he's ready to take power and to signal what his aims are as Prime Minister. And as Nicholas Witchell was saying, it is the culmination of a lifelong dream for him, and certainly a very real dream, since he and Tony Blair formed that very successful partnership as backbenchers, as Labour backbenchers back in the early 80s. They were elected in 83 together, and they've been a great partnership ever since. Many ups and downs, of course, but this is the natural outcome of that partnership, which is that Mr. Blair has been in power for 10 years, and Mr. Brown, having wanted to step in for so long, now gets the opportunity. Nick, it's remarkable to look at these pictures now and to realise that Gordon Brown's dream has finally come true.
It's happened, and so often, Huw, he must have believed it wouldn't. In '94, when Tony Blair persuaded him to stand aside so that he and not Gordon Brown would become leader of the party, he must have thought that. When Tony Blair, he believed, broke a promise to him to stand aside, he must have believed it. When in 2004 it looked like the Prime Minister Tony Blair would resign, and it didn't happen, he must have felt that. And again recently, when Blairites said, we're going to stop him, we're going to find anybody to put up against him. But he has done it, and he will feel that that is a real achievement, occasionally against real odds.
The gates have opened because the new Prime Minister has just turned off Trafalgar Square into Whitehall, and within a few seconds, it's a bit of a slow progress at the moment, but within a few seconds we expect the Prime Ministerial car to turn into Downing Street, and for Mr. Brown with his wife to acknowledge all the applause of the crowd at the gates, and then to step out of the car when they get here to make that statement. The traffic has been stopped in one direction, and it's a clear path for them now as they pass the old agriculture building, the Scottish office as it was, Dover House, Horse Guards Arch, and down onto the other section of Whitehall, past the Welsh office, and to turn right into Downing Street any moment. Gordon Brown enters Downing Street as Britain's new Prime Minister.
I've just accepted the invitation of Her Majesty the Queen to form a government. This will be a new government with new priorities. And I have been privileged to have been granted the great opportunity to serve my country. And at all times, I will be strong in purpose, steadfast in will, resolute in action, in the service of what matters to the British people, meeting the concerns and aspirations of our whole country. I grew up in the town that I now represent in Parliament. I went to the local school. I wouldn't be standing here without the opportunities that I received there. And I want the best of chances for everyone. That is my mission, that if we can fulfill the potential and realize the talents of all our people, then I am absolutely sure that Britain can be the great global success story of this century. As I have traveled around the country, and as I have listened and I've learnt from the British people, and as Prime Minister, I will continue to listen and learn from the British people, I've heard the need for change. Change in our NHS, change in our schools, change with affordable housing, change to build trust in government, change to protect and extend the British way of life. And this need for change cannot be met by the old politics. So I will reach out beyond narrow party interest. I will build a government that uses all the talents. I will invite men and women of goodwill to contribute their energies in a new spirit of public service to make our nation what it can be. And I am convinced that there is no weakness in Britain today that cannot be overcome by the strength of the British people. On this day, I remember words that have stayed with me since my childhood and which matter a great deal to me today. My school motto, I will try my utmost. This is my promise to all of the people of Britain. And now let the work of change begin. Thank you.
Gordon Brown sets the tone and promises to do his utmost as Britain's new Prime Minister. A few more smiles and a few more waves to the cameras, demanding all the material they can get. Mr. Brown clearly impatient to get inside to sort out the makeup of his government. Gordon Brown crosses the threshold of number 10 for the first time as Britain's Prime Minister. Nick Robinson is still with me. Nick, a very emotional Gordon Brown.
Hesitant, nervy as he got out the car, unsure where to stand. His voice croaking, cracking even at times, I thought. Delivered with confidence, with strength of voice, but still that nervousness very, very evident, and even the hesitance there. We got used with Tony Blair, the man who loves the cameras. They were shouting behind us here, Huw, weren't they? In the middle. They wanted to make sure the picture had the number 10 over there. That's not Gordon Brown. He didn't quite know where he should stand, but his message was an intriguing one, wasn't it? Change. That was the signal he wanted to send, and a degree of humility, quoting his school motto there at the end, that he would try my utmost.
It was interesting too that when he was looking at the media, that despite the sign of the fact that he was slightly unsettled by all the attention, and it is pretty daunting sight, Nick, isn't it, when you look up at the ranks of the cameras here, He was very determined to get the message out cleanly, flawlessly, and that's exactly what he did.
That's exactly right. He knew that these words will be dwelt on. They will be listened and watched by millions of people. They'll be repeated again and again. And of course, he'll be tested against them. When people see the ups and downs that any Prime Minister has and any government has, they'll say, did he live up to what he said? And which is why it's an intriguing choice. I will do my utmost. It's just saying I'll try, really. You can't be found failing or wanting against that. But the signal of change, not just on health, he said, or education, or affordable housing, or indeed on trust, but intriguingly about our sense of what it means to be British. And my guess is that will be one of the great surprises of this Brown administration. What we call constitutional change sounds terribly dull, doesn't it? But actually, I think will leap from the page as being a sense that he wants to restore in people a sense of what being British really means.
And just a thought now, Nick, on what's happening inside the door, behind the door, people lining up to greet him and, of course, making his way, I'd have thought, into the cabinet room.
Well, you saw them look nervously to the door, weren't sure whether to look at the cameras or to look at the door. That's because they were expecting the door to be opened and for the Cabinet Secretary then to greet them. He is their host, if you like, here. As the head of the Home Civil Service, he is now the guide taking them around Downing Street, and we could hear here on the street, I'm not sure if viewers at home could hear it, the applause of the staff of Downing Street who were arrayed there in the opening to greet him. And I think the first thing will happen is he'll actually be just shown geographically around. Now, of course, unlike Tony Blair, who'd only stepped into Downing Street once before he became Prime Minister, he's very familiar with it all. He doesn't need a guide at all. He knows where everything is. He's been into every room. He's worked into every room. But he'll be shown round nonetheless. And then it's on with the calls. It's on with those important booked telephone calls to President Bush, President Putin, the President of France, President Sarkozy, and others. Only then will he be able to sit down and say, well, here's my list for the Cabinet. Mr. Cabinet Secretary, any problems here? Any difficulties in making this happen? And the calls, I suspect, will begin quite possibly first to the people who will be disappointed rather than the people who will get jobs. And we're not expecting those names tonight, more likely to come tomorrow, possibly around lunchtime.
So this was the scene in Downing Street just a few minutes ago when Gordon Brown arrived as Britain's new Prime Minister, along with his wife. They acknowledged all the men and women of the press and media before they went in to meet the staff, many of whom, of course, as Nick was saying, they will know. And Nick, just to pick up on that theme again in terms of the reshuffle, what we associate on these days is the image of ministers walking up and down Downing Street. Are they looking happy? Are they looking depressed? We're not likely to see that parade today.
Certainly won't see that parade today. And interestingly, Huw, we may not even see the traditional parade tomorrow. We know that the Chancellor wants to make sure that I've just called him the Chancellor. He's the Prime Minister, of course. I'm still having to get used to it myself. We know that the new Prime Minister wants to make sure that his reshuffle is not, frankly, the mess that many Tony Blair reshuffles were. So he has to dot the I's and cross the T's, has to say, well, if I move that here and if I do that, will it cause a problem? And there are Whitehall administrative changes. Talk, for example, of the DTI either being completely closed down or certainly dismantled and large parts being parcelled elsewhere. That involves conversations with the civil service, not just who's in, who's out in terms of politics. So we're led to believe that almost certainly be no announcements tonight, just possible that they will confirm what we all believe, which is that Alistair Darling will replace him as Chancellor, if only just to settle the markets when they open in the morning. But otherwise, we'll hear it all in the lunchtime.
And a very nasty last question for you, Nick. Any thoughts on Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary? I know there's been no spin on it at all, so it's a bit of a dark area for us, but any thoughts?
Terribly difficult. My sense is that they believe that Margaret Beckett should be moved. The difficulty is doing it. Interestingly, the political priority is no longer the Foreign Office. It is, first of all, the Treasury, of course, needs to get that right. Home Office, because of immigration, of course. Health, crucially, the top of his list here. So my guess would be Margaret Beckett might hang on, look for young David Miliband, who almost ran for the leadership. Home Secretary, maybe. Foreign Secretary at the outside. But the honest answer is, we don't know, I don't know.
Well, it makes it exciting. Nick, thank you very much. And that is it from Downing Street and from Westminster for this special coverage. Tony Blair has stepped down as Prime Minister. He has handed over to Gordon Brown, who is now in Downing Street as Britain's new Prime Minister. I'll leave you with some of the key images of the day, a big day, and a big day in terms of Britain's history as we look ahead to a new era under Gordon Brown. Goodbye.
Yes.
some may belittle politics, but it is still the arena that sets the heart beating a little faster. And if it is on occasions the place of low skullduggery, it is more often the place for the pursuit of noble causes. And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is that, the end.
I still remember how you... Hi! I don't think we'll miss you. It started, I will never know, but now I've reached my limit.
On this day, I remember words that have stayed with me since my childhood and which matter a great deal to me today. My school motto, I will try my utmost. This is my promise to all of the people of Britain. And now let the work of change begin. Thank you.
Live to Wimbledon, next on BBC One, and the very latest from Sue Barker.